The Frontier Saloon pulsed with tobacco smoke and whiskey-soaked laughter, a place where men came to forget the day's hardships and women knew better than to enter alone. Victoria Blackwood had broken that unspoken rule tonight. She stood at the bar, her slender frame draped in widow's black, her golden hair tucked beneath a modest bonnet. Though not tall, something in her posture commanded space, the way she held her shoulders, the steadiness of her gaze. "Another whiskey for the lady," a gruff voice slurred behind her. "A pretty thing like you shouldn't drink alone." Victoria didn't turn. Her fingers tightened around her glass knuckles, whitening. "I'm fine as I am, thank you." Three men encircled her now, smelling of horses and hard labor. The largest of them, a bearded giant with tobacco-stained teeth, leaned close enough that she could feel his breath on her neck. "You're Edward Blackwood's widow, ain't you? The one who thinks she's some kind of healer." He chuckled, looking to his companions. "My cousin said your husband died anyway, despite all your herbs and potions." Victoria's blue eyes remained fixed on her drink, deep as winter ice. Maybe if she'd been tending to her husband, instead of playing doctor to half the county, he'd still be breathing. Another man added, thinner than the first, but with the same cruel smile. The third man, youngest of the group, reached for her arm. Maybe she needs a new man to look after her now that... The moment his fingers touched her sleeve, something changed in Victoria's eyes. A flicker like lightning across distant clouds. "Don't touch me." Her voice was soft, but carried a warning cold as mountain frost. The young man's grip tightened. "Come now, don't be..." What happened next occurred so quickly that later no witness could agree on the sequence of events. Victoria's arm moved in a precise arc. Glass shattered. The young man stumbled backward, clutching his throat, eyes wide with shock. The bearded giant lunged forward with a roar. Victoria pivoted, her movements fluid as water. Something flashed in her hand, a small knife from her pocket perhaps, or a broken bottle neck. The second man crashed into a table. The third grasped at empty air, then collapsed. Silence fell across the saloon. Victoria stood alone in a circle of still bodies, her breathing steady, her face pale but composed. Blood spread across the rough wooden floor, seeping between the planks like spilled wine. She looked down at her hands, then up at the horrified faces surrounding her. "They attacked me," she said simply. "I defended myself." But in the frontier town of Redemption Springs in 1883, such distinctions rarely mattered when the dead were men and the survivor was a woman. "And that's how they put her in the steel cage, my dear granddaughter." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the parlor of the modest Colorado home. Outside, snow fell in gentle waves, wrapping the world in hushed whiteness. Inside, warmth and the smell of pine logs created a cocoon around the old man and the wide-eyed girl seated at his feet. Samuel Mitchell, 85 years old, with hands gnarled as ancient oak roots, leaned forward in his rocking chair. His granddaughter Emma, barely 10, gazed up at him with an expression balanced between horror and fascination. "A cage grandpa-like for animals," she whispered. Samuel nodded, his weathered face solemn in the firelight. Right in the middle of the town square, big enough for her to stand up in but not much else, had iron bars thick as your wrist and a lock big as my fist. He held up a gnarled hand to demonstrate. "But why, even if those men died, shouldn't she have had a trial?" Samuel's eyes grew distant, looking past the comfortable room to a harder time. "That would have been the proper way, yes, but Redemption Springs wasn't much for proper in those days. Sheriff Caldwell claimed it was for her own protection while awaiting trial. Said the townspeople might lynch her otherwise." He shook his head. "But that was a lie, Emma. The cage wasn't to protect Victoria Blackwood. It was to humiliate her, to break her spirit." "Did it?" Emma asked, her small face serious. "Did they break her?" A smile tugged at the corner of Samuel's mouth. "That's getting ahead in our story. But I'll tell you this much, she was the bravest woman I ever knew. And what happened to her in Redemption Springs was just the beginning." Emma pulled her quilt tighter around her shoulders. "Tell me everything, Grandpa. Don't leave anything out." Samuel's eyes twinkled. "It's a long tale stretching across years and carrying many souls in its current. But if you're patient, I'll tell you the true story of the woman in the steel cage and of the man who saw beyond the bars when everyone else saw only a monster." Redemption Springs, 1885. 2 years had passed since Victoria Blackwood killed 3 men in self-defense at the Frontier Saloon. 2 years since Judge Reynolds' cousin to one of the dead men sentenced her to indefinite confinement until a proper federal authority could be consulted. 2 years since Sheriff Caldwell had commissioned the blacksmith to build a cage in the town square, strong enough to hold a grizzly, he'd specified. 2 years and still Victoria Blackwood waited. The steel cage stood on a wooden platform at the center of the dusty square, its black bars stark against the backdrop of false-fronted buildings. Large enough for a person to stand upright and take 3 steps in any direction, but no more. A bucket in one corner, a thin pallet in another, and in the center, as still as the bars that confined her, stood Victoria Blackwood. At 35, she remained a striking woman, despite her circumstances. Tall for a woman, but slender, with once golden hair, now dulled to the color of dry wheat hanging loose around a face that might have been beautiful before grief and confinement had hollowed her cheeks and hardened the set of her mouth. But it was her eyes that held people's attention, blue as a mountain lake in winter, deep with secrets and utterly terrifyingly alive in a face otherwise composed as carved stone. A crude sign hung from the cage, $10 to touch the beast. Beneath it in smaller letters, proceeds to Town Improvement Fund. The morning stage had just arrived, disgorging its usual mix of salesmen, fortune seekers, and the occasional lost soul. Among them stood a man whose stillness matched Victoria's own. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a trail-dusty coat over clothes that had once been fine, but now showed the wear of hard travel. His face, half hidden beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, bore the weathered lines of a man who had seen too much of life's harsher truths. A long scar traced from beneath his right ear down into his collar, pale against his sun-darkened skin. Thomas Harrington watched the cage and its occupant with an expression impossible to read. Around him, townspeople hustled about their morning business, most giving the cage a wide berth, though a few slowed to stare or mutter comments behind raised hands. Children darted closer on dares, giggling nervously before racing away. Victoria Blackwood acknowledged none of it. Her gaze remained fixed on some distant point beyond the mountains that rimmed the valley, as though the town, the cage, and the curious eyes simply didn't exist. "First time in Redemption Springs, mister." Thomas turned to find a round-faced man with an impressive mustache eyeing him curiously. The man's vest strained against his substantial belly, and a tin star gleamed on his chest. "Yes," Thomas replied, his voice deep and measured. "Just arrived. Sheriff Caldwell." The man extended his hand. "Welcome to our little corner of civilization." Thomas shook the offered hand briefly. "Thomas Harrington." "Well, Mr. Harrington, what brings you to these parts? Business or pleasure?" Thomas's eyes drifted back to the cage. "Neither exactly. I'm a doctor, was at least." The sheriff followed his gaze, understanding dawning on his florid face. "Ah, I see you've noticed our local attraction. That there's the Blackwood Witch, killed 3 men with her bare hands, they say. Some folks claim she used dark arts. Is that so?" Thomas's tone remained neutral, giving away nothing. Sheriff Caldwell nodded eagerly. "Dangerous woman? Had to put her where she couldn't hurt nobody else. Federal marshals supposed to come take her to a proper women's prison, but seems they keep forgetting about our little town." He chuckled. "Can't say I mind too much. She brings in good money from travelers wanting a look. Even better from those brave enough to touch her." Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And how long has she been in that cage, Sheriff?" "Going on 2 years now." Caldwell rocked back on his heels, seemingly untroubled by this fact. "She don't complain much these days. Used to scream and carry on something fierce at first, but she's settled down real nice." A commotion drew their attention across the square. A group of boys, none older than 12, had gathered near the cage. One held a stone in his hand, weighing it thoughtfully. "Gonna do it, Billy?" another boy challenged. "Course I am. I am," the first boy replied, though his hand trembled slightly. "My pa says she killed my Uncle Frank. Says she deserves worse than a cage." He drew back his arm and threw. The stone arced through the morning air and clanged against the bars. Victoria didn't flinch, didn't even blink. It was as though she hadn't heard it at all. Emboldened, another boy grabbed a stone, then another. Thomas stepped forward, but Sheriff Caldwell caught his arm. "Best not interfere, Doc. Folks here have their reasons for hating her. Those boys lost kin to her wickedness." Thomas shook free of the sheriff's grip. "They're throwing stones at a caged woman." "She's hardly even a woman anymore," Caldwell said with a shrug. "More like a wild animal that's been tamed." Thomas strode across the square, his long legs covering the ground quickly. The boys saw him coming and hesitated, another stone half raised. "That's enough," Thomas said, his voice quiet but carrying authority that made the boy step back. "Go on home now." "You can't tell us what to do," the first boy said, though he lowered his arm. "You're not from here." "No, I'm not." Thomas looked from the boys to the cage and back again. "But where I come from, men don't torment helpless creatures, and they certainly don't teach boys to do so." "She ain't helpless," the boy protested. "She's a killer, a witch." "She looks like a woman to me," Thomas replied evenly. "A woman who can't defend herself against stones thrown by brave boys like yourselves." The sarcasm wasn't lost on the oldest boy, who flushed red. "My pa says your pa isn't here." Thomas cut him off. "I am, and I'm telling you to go home." Something in his voice, or perhaps in the intensity of his gaze, convinced the boys to retreat, though they shot resentful glances over their shoulders as they left. Thomas approached the cage, slowly maintaining a respectful distance. Up close, the crude workmanship of the prison was more apparent: uneven Wells bars spaced just close enough to prevent escape, but wide enough to let in rain and snow, the platform beneath stained dark from years of exposure. Victoria Blackwood hadn't moved. Her eyes remained fixed on the distant mountains, though Thomas sensed a new awareness in her stillness, like a deer that's caught a hunter's scent. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said quietly, removing his hat. "My name is Thomas Harrington." No response, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. "I've come a long way to find you." Still nothing, but as he watched her hands folded in her lap, roughened by exposure, trembled almost imperceptibly. Thomas replaced his hat. "I'll come back," he said simply, then turned and walked away. From the shadows of the mercantile's porch, Sheriff Caldwell watched with narrowed eyes. Night fell over Redemption Springs, bringing with it a heavy rain that emptied the streets and drove even the hardiest drinkers home from the saloon. Water drummed against rooftops and transformed the dusty square into a sea of mud. Lightning flashed briefly, illuminating the steel cage and its solitary occupant. Victoria Blackwood sat perfectly still as the rain poured through the bars. Her thin dress clung to her body and her hair hung in sodden ropes around her face. She made no attempt to seek what little shelter the cage's roof might provide. Instead, she tilted her face up to the storm, letting the water stream over her features like tears she could no longer cry. In the darkness of her mind, memories flickered like the lightning above. Edward's face still handsome despite the illness that had hollowed his cheeks. His gentle hands once strong enough to break a wild horse reduced to trembling weakness. His voice growing fainter as fever claimed him. "Promise me you'll keep living, Victoria. The world needs your gift." She had promised, and then she had failed him. The sound of footsteps in mud broke through her reverie. Victoria lowered her face but didn't turn toward the noise. Probably some drunk come to gawk at the witch in the cage. Or worse, come to pay his $10 for the privilege of poking her through the bars. "Mrs. Blackwood." The voice was low-cultured and achingly familiar in its kindness. No one had spoken to her with such gentle respect in 2 years. Slowly, Victoria turned. Through the curtain of rain, she could make out a tall figure holding a large umbrella. The stranger from this morning, the one who had stopped the boys from throwing stones. "You shouldn't be out in this weather," he said, stepping closer. Victoria didn't respond. Her voice had grown rusty from disuse, and she saw little point in speaking to anyone anymore. The man Harrington he'd called himself moved to the edge of the platform. Rainwater cascaded from the umbrella's edge as he carefully positioned it so that it sheltered her cage as best it could. "I brought you this." He held up a thick woolen blanket. "May I?" Victoria stared at him, uncomprehending. Was this some new form of torment? A kindness offered only to be withdrawn? When she didn't answer, he carefully folded the blanket and pushed it through the bars, letting it fall onto the platform within her reach. Then he stepped back, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm a doctor," he said. "Or I was during the war. I know that prolonged exposure, especially in cold rain like this, can lead to illness. Pneumonia is a particular risk." Victoria's gaze dropped to the blanket, then back to his face, partially shadowed beneath his hat. In the lightning flashes, she could see the scar along his neck, the weathered lines around eyes that looked at her with what pity curiosity. "Why?" The words scraped from her throat, barely audible above the rain. He seemed to consider his answer carefully. "Because you are cold and wet, and I have a blanket to spare." "No," Victoria forced herself to continue each word an effort after so much silence. "Why are you here in Redemption Springs?" A flicker of something crossed his face, surprised perhaps that she had spoken at all. "I'm looking for someone," he replied after a moment. Victoria almost laughed, a rusty, broken sound that died before it reached her lips. "Not me." "No," he agreed, "not you." They fell silent, the rain filling the space between them. Victoria made no move toward the blanket, though her body trembled with cold. "I knew your husband," Thomas said finally. Victoria went very still. Even her breathing seemed to pause. "Edward Blackwood," he continued. "We served together. In the war." "You're lying." Her voice was stronger now, edged with something that might have been anger. "Edward never spoke of you. He might not have mentioned me by name. We weren't close friends exactly, but we were in the same field hospital outside Richmond in '64. Thomas's eyes took on a distant look. He was brought in with a bullet wound to the shoulder. I was the doctor who removed it. Victoria's gaze sharpened, studying his face with new intensity. Edward had a scar on his left shoulder. Star-shaped. Thomas nodded. The bullet fragmented. I had to dig out 4 pieces. Victoria's hands tightened in her lap. This stranger knew things about Edward that few others could know. But why come now after all this time? What do you want from me? She asked. Nothing. Thomas stepped back, still holding the umbrella over her cage. I just thought you should have a blanket on a night like this. And perhaps know that not everyone in this town sees you as what that sign suggests. He turned to go, then paused. I'm staying at the hotel. Room 3 if you need anything. Victoria almost laughed again. Need anything, as if she could leave this cage to knock on his door. I don't need your pity, doctor, she said to his back. Thomas glanced over his shoulder. Good, because I'm not offering it. Then he was gone, striding through the mud and rain, leaving only the blanket as evidence he'd been there at all. Victoria stared at the woolen bundle for a long moment. Then slowly she reached for it, wrapping it around her shoulders. The wool was thick and smelled faintly of tobacco and pine clean masculine scents that reminded her of a life before steel bars and staring eyes. For the first time in many months, Victoria Blackwood allowed herself to weep, the sound of her sobs lost in the storm that raged around her cage. Elizabeth Wilson moved through the back alleys of Redemption Springs like a ghost, her black morning dress blending with the pre-dawn shadows. The widow of Reverend Wilson carried a small basket covered with a checkered cloth, her steps hurried but deliberate. 6 months had passed since influenza had taken her husband of 30 years, leaving her alone in the small parsonage beside the white-clapboard church. 6 months of quiet grief, of townspeople's awkward condolences, of wondering what purpose remained for a childless widow of 53. She had found that purpose in the most unexpected place. The town square was deserted at this hour, the shops still closed, the saloon long since emptied of its nightly revelers. Only the steel cage stood as a dark silhouette against the graying sky, its occupant a motionless shadow within. Elizabeth approached cautiously, though she had made this journey many times before. Sheriff Caldwell had warned her once about consorting with the criminal, but Elizabeth had simply fixed him with the stern gaze that had once cowed unruly Sunday school students and replied, "I believe our Lord instructed us to visit those in prison, Sheriff. Or did you miss that Sunday sermon?" He hadn't bothered her since, though she was careful to come only in the earliest hours when few would see. "Mrs. Blackwood," she whispered as she neared the cage. "It's Elizabeth." Victoria stirred, emerging from whatever waking dream had occupied her mind. In the growing light, Elizabeth could see she was wrapped in a woolen blanket she didn't recognize. "I've brought you some bread," Elizabeth continued, setting her basket on the platform. "And cheese. There's a bit of apple cake too, Mrs. Henderson's recipe, though I doubt I did it justice." Victoria watched silently as Elizabeth removed the items and carefully pushed them through the bars. "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice soft but clear. Elizabeth smiled. In the early days, Victoria had rarely spoken, barely acknowledged her presence. Progress came in small steps. "You're most welcome." Elizabeth hesitated, then added, "I saw Dr. Wilson yesterday. He asked after you." A flicker of something crossed Victoria's face. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that you endure." Elizabeth glanced around the empty square. "He's troubled by your situation, you know. Says it's inhumane keeping anyone in these conditions." "The good doctor's concern is noted," Victoria replied with the faintest hint of bitterness, "though it changes nothing." Elizabeth sighed. "He's a kind man, Victoria, one of the few in this town with the courage to question what's happened to you." Victoria looked down at the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "There's another," she said quietly. "A stranger. Dr. Harrington, he called himself." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose. "The man who arrived on yesterday's stage, I haven't met him yet. He brought me this." Victoria touched the wool. "In the rain last night." "That was unexpectedly kind." Elizabeth studied Victoria's face. "Did he say why, He claims to have known Edward during the war." Victoria's blue eyes lifted to meet Elizabeth's. "He knew about the scar on Edward's shoulder." Elizabeth considered this. "Do you believe him?" "I don't know." Victoria's gaze drifted toward the hotel at the far end of the street. "He said he's looking for someone, but not me." Curious, Elizabeth gathered her now empty basket. "Well, I should go before the town wakes. I'll come again tomorrow." Victoria nodded, then said, "Elizabeth." She stopped, seeming to struggle with words long unused. "Why do you help me after what I've done?" Elizabeth's kind face softened further. "What have you done?" Victoria defended yourself against men who meant you harm, practiced healing arts that helped many in this town before they turned on you. She shook her head. "I don't see the monster they claim. I see a woman who has suffered greatly." "Your husband would not approve of your friendship with a killer," Victoria said. "My Jonathan believed in grace above all else," Elizabeth replied firmly. "And he knew, as I do, that there's more to your story than most in this town care to learn." She paused. "Speaking of which, Mary Johnson asked about you yesterday." Victoria went very still. "Mary, the blacksmith's daughter." Elizabeth nodded. "She's 10 now. Beautiful child. She wanted to know if you were the lady who made the magic tea when she was sick." "She remembers." Victoria's voice held disbelief. "Children remember more than we give them credit for." Elizabeth's expression grew troubled. Her father didn't take kindly to her questions, I'm afraid. "That man has a temper, especially since his brother." She trailed off, regretting her words. "Since his brother died at my hands," Victoria finished flatly. Elizabeth sighed. "I should go. Take care, Victoria. And," she glanced at the hotel, "be cautious with this Dr. Harrington. Not everyone who offers kindness does so without motive." Victoria watched the older woman hurry across the square basket clutched to her chest. When Elizabeth disappeared around the corner of the church, Victoria turned her attention to the food. Real bread still slightly warm, cheese that hadn't been gnawed by rats, simple pleasures that had become luxuries. As she ate, her gaze kept drifting to the hotel. Who was Thomas Harrington really? And who was he searching for in Redemption Springs? More importantly, why did she care? Thomas Harrington stood at the window of room 3 watching the first businesses open for the day. His room afforded a clear view of the town square in its central cage. He'd observed the older woman's visit at dawn, the pastor's widow he'd learned from the hotel clerk, a small kindness in a town that seemed to thrive on cruelty. He turned from the window and moved to the bed, kneeling beside it to retrieve a worn leather satchel from underneath. From it, he removed a folded piece of paper yellowed with age and creased from frequent handling. He spread it carefully on the small desk and stared at the familiar handwriting. "If anything happens to me, find Victoria." She'll need a friend when I'm gone. Edward Blackwood, 1863, 22 years. Thomas had carried this note for 22 years, a promise made to a dying soldier he barely knew. A promise he'd failed to keep until now. It had taken him nearly 2 years to track Victoria Blackwood to Redemption Springs. 2 years of following rumors of a healing woman who'd killed 3 men with unnatural strength. 2 years of wondering if he was chasing a ghost. And now he'd found her alive, but imprisoned in conditions that would break most souls. Yet something in her eyes told him that Victoria Blackwood was not broken. Damaged, perhaps. Withdrawn. But not broken. From his satchel, Thomas removed a small leather-bound journal. Opening it to a blank page, he began to write in a neat, precise hand. May 17, 1885. Redemption Springs. I have found Edward's widow at last. The situation is worse than I feared. She has been held in a public cage for 2 years, treated as less than human by the very people she once healed. The sheriff profits from her humiliation, charging money for gawkers to view and even touch her through the bars. She recognized my reference to Edward's wound. This confirms her identity beyond doubt. She is suspicious of my motives, understandably so. I must proceed carefully. Sheriff Caldwell watches me, already sensing, perhaps, that I am not the casual traveler I claim to be. Tomorrow I will speak with the town doctor. Perhaps he can provide more information about the events that led to her imprisonment. Thomas closed the journal and returned it to his satchel. Then he reached for his medical bag, checking its contents with practiced efficiency. Bandages, surgical tools, vials of medicine, the tools of a profession he'd abandoned after seeing too much death during the war. But old habits died hard, and the bag had proven useful in his travels. A knock at the door interrupted his inventory. Thomas closed the bag and moved to answer. Sheriff Caldwell stood in the hallway, thumbs hooked in his belt, a forced smile beneath his bushy mustache. "Morning, Doc. Thought I might show you around our fine town today." Thomas recognized the offer for what it was, surveillance disguised as hospitality. "That's kind of you, Sheriff, but I have some business to attend to." "What kind of business brings a former doctor to Redemption Springs, if you don't mind my asking?" Caldwell's tone remained friendly, but his eyes had hardened. "Personal matters," Thomas replied evenly. "Nothing that should concern the law. Everything in my town concerns me." The sheriff's smile thinned, "especially strangers who take an interest in our local situation." "You mean Mrs. Blackwood?" "That's right." Caldwell leaned against the door frame, blocking the exit. "Saw you chatting with her in the rain last night, giving her a blanket. Most folks know better than to get close to her." "I'm a doctor. I don't like to see suffering when it can be prevented." "Noble sentiment." Caldwell nodded as though considering this. "But that woman's dangerous. Killed 3 men with her bare hands. Some say she used witchcraft." "Do you believe that, Sheriff?" Thomas asked quietly. Caldwell's expression flickered. "Doesn't matter what I believe. Town's decided she's guilty, and until the federal marshal comes to take her to a proper prison, my job is to keep her secured. In a cage, in the town square, where children throw stones at her. Now those boys yesterday were just acting as they've been taught," Thomas finished. "Tell me, Sheriff, has Mrs. Blackwood had a proper trial?" Caldwell straightened his hand, drifting toward the pistol at his hip. "Judge Reynolds held a hearing. Testimonies were given. She was found guilty. By a judge whose cousin was one of the dead men." The sheriff's face darkened. "You're asking a lot of questions for someone passing through, Doc." "Just trying to understand the situation." Thomas met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Where I come from, even the guilty deserve humane treatment." "Well, you ain't where you come from." Caldwell stepped back, freeing the doorway. "Enjoy your stay in Redemption Springs, Dr. Harrington, however long it might be." The threat hung in the air as the sheriff turned and walked away, boots heavy on the wooden floor. Thomas closed the door, slowly considering. He'd made an enemy, which complicated matters. But he'd never expected this to be simple. He returned to the window gaze, finding the steel cage in the square below. Victoria sat motionless, the blanket he'd given her folded neatly beside her. Even from this distance, he could sense her awareness, the way she tracked movement around her while appearing to notice nothing. 22 years since he'd made a promise to a dying man. 22 years of carrying the weight of that unfulfilled oath. "I found her, Edward," he murmured to the empty room. "Now I just need to figure out how to help her." The afternoon sun beat down on Redemption Springs, turning the town square into a dust-filled oven. Victoria had positioned herself to catch what little shade the cage's roof provided, but it offered minimal relief. The blanket Thomas had given her was carefully folded beneath her, providing some cushion against the hard platform. She watched through half-lidded eyes as the town went about its business. Mrs. Henderson sweeping the boardwalk in front of her husband's general store. The banker, Mr. Collins, hurrying across the square with ledgers tucked under his arm. Children playing a game of tag, giving her cage a wide berth as they'd been taught. And there, emerging from the doctor's office on the corner, Thomas Harrington, deep in conversation with Dr. Wilson. The 2 men paused on the porch, shaking hands before Thomas descended the steps and headed toward the hotel. Victoria wondered what they had discussed. Her most likely. Wilson was one of the few in town who had shown her any kindness after her arrest, insisting she receive at least minimal care during her confinement. But he was a cautious man unwilling to challenge the town's judgment too openly. As Thomas crossed the square, his path took him near her cage. He slowed, removing his hat as he approached. "Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her, his voice low. "How are you faring in this heat?" Victoria considered, ignoring him, retreating back into the silence that had been her shield for so long. But curiosity, a feeling she'd almost forgotten, stirred within her. "I've endured worse," she replied. He nodded, studying her face with a doctor's assessing gaze. "May I bring you some water?" "The sheriff's deputy will bring the daily ration at 4, she said. "1 bucket, for drinking and other needs." Thomas's jaw tightened. "That's barbaric. That's justice in Redemption Springs." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "You spoke with Dr. Wilson." It wasn't a question, but Thomas answered anyway. "Yes, he seems concerned about your health." "James Wilson is a decent man trapped by his own cowardice," Victoria said without malice. "He knows this is wrong, but he fears the town's judgment more than he values doing right." Thomas glanced around the square, noting the curious stares directed their way. "You have at least one true friend here, the pastor's widow, Elizabeth." Victoria's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "She brings food when she can, speaks to me like a human being." "As do I," Thomas pointed out. Victoria studied him, her blue eyes piercing despite the exhaustion evident in her face. "Why, you claim to have known Edward, but that was a lifetime ago. What do you want from me, Dr. Harrington?" Before Thomas could answer, a shrill voice cut through the square. "Get away from her!" A heavy-set man with a blacksmith's powerful arms stormed toward them, dragging a young girl by the wrist. The child, no more than 10, struggled against his grip, her face streaked with tears. "Johnson," Thomas said quietly, recognizing the blacksmith from Dr. Wilson's description. "You," Johnson jabbed a thick finger at Thomas. "You're the stranger who's been talking to the witch, giving her comforts she don't deserve." Thomas straightened, standing his ground as the larger man approached. "I was speaking with Mrs. Blackwood, yes." "Well, don't," Johnson pulled his daughter forward. "See this child? The witch nearly killed her brother, and now I find Mary here trying to bring her flowers." He shook the girl's arm, causing her to whimper. "After what she did to our family." Victoria had gone very still, her eyes fixed on the child. "Mary," she said softly. The girl looked up, her tears subsiding as she stared at Victoria with something like wonder. You remember me?" "Of course." Victoria's voice was gentle in a way Thomas hadn't heard before. "You had the fever. 3 summers ago now." "Shut your mouth," Johnson yanked his daughter back. "Don't you speak to my child, you murdering—" "That's enough," Thomas interrupted, stepping between Johnson and the cage. "You're frightening your daughter." "Mind your own business. Who's a stranger?" Johnson snarled. "This town was peaceful before you showed up asking questions." "Peaceful." Thomas's voice remained calm, but steel entered his tone. "You call keeping a woman in a cage peaceful? I call it justice." Johnson's face had reddened with rage. "She killed my brother, Frank, never hurt nobody in his life, and she butchered him like an animal." Victoria's hands gripped the bars of her cage, knuckles white. "Your brother and his friends cornered me in an alley, Mr. Johnson." They had plans for Edward Blackwood's widow that didn't involve conversation. The square had gone silent, townspeople freezing in place to watch the confrontation. Even Mary had stopped crying, looking between her father and Victoria with wide, confused eyes. "Liar," Johnson spat. "Frank was a good Christian man. Ask Dr. Wilson what condition I was in when they brought me to jail." Victoria continued, her voice carrying across the square. "Ask him about the bruises, the torn dress, what your good Christian brother tried to do to me." Thomas watched understanding dawn on several faces in the growing crowd. Not everyone had known these details, it seemed. Johnson released his daughter's wrist and lunged toward the cage. "I'll kill you myself, witch!" Thomas moved quickly, intercepting the blacksmith with a strength that belied his lean frame. "That's not happening," he said, grappling with the larger man. "Let go of me!" Johnson swung a massive fist that Thomas barely dodged. "Stop it, Papa!" Mary cried, tugging at her father's shirt. "Stop!" The confrontation might have escalated further if not for Sheriff Caldwell's timely arrival. "What in tarnation is going on here?" he demanded, pushing through the crowd. Johnson pointed a trembling finger at Victoria. "She's spreading lies about Frank. Says he tried to. He couldn't finish, glancing at his daughter. "Mr. Johnson, take your child home," Caldwell ordered. "This ain't a conversation for young ears." Johnson hesitated, fury still etched on his face, but finally nodded. He grabbed Mary's hand again, gentler this time, and began to lead her away. The girl looked back over her shoulder. "Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Blackwood," she called. "Mama said it saved my life." Johnson yanked her forward, disappearing into the crowd with his daughter in tow. Sheriff Caldwell turned his attention to Thomas. I thought we had an understanding about stirring up trouble." "I was having a civil conversation until Mr. Johnson arrived," Thomas replied. "Civil conversations with murderers ain't welcome in my town." Caldwell stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm watching you, Doc. One more incident like this, and you'll be on the next stage out of Redemption Springs. Or worse. The sheriff turned to the dispersing crowd. Show's over, folks. Go on about your business. As people reluctantly moved away, Thomas glanced at Victoria. She had retreated to the center of her cage, face once again composed into its habitual mask of indifference. But her eyes, those startling blue eyes, held his for a long moment. In them, he saw not a witch or a killer, but a woman who had endured unspeakable injustice with dignity intact. A woman worth saving. Thomas nodded slightly, a silent promise, before turning to walk away. Night fell once more over Redemption Springs, bringing with it a chorus of crickets and the distant howl of coyotes from the hills. The town had grown quiet, windows darkening one by one as respectable citizens retired for the evening. Only the saloon remained lively, piano music and raucous laughter spilling onto the empty street. In his hotel room, Thomas sat at the small desk, a single lamp burning as he wrote in his journal. Johnson's reaction confirms what Dr. Wilson hinted at. Victoria killed those men in self-defense. They had attacked her intending to violate her. The town knows this, or at least suspects it, yet still treats her as a murderous criminal. More curious is young Mary Johnson's comment about Victoria saving her life. Dr. Wilson filled in the details 3 years ago. An outbreak of scarlet fever swept through the children of Redemption Springs. The town's youngsters were dying until Victoria stepped in with herbal remedies that Dr. Wilson credits with saving at least a dozen lives, including Mary Johnson's. Yet this same woman is now considered a witch, a monster to be caged and tormented. The human capacity for ingratitude is truly boundless. A soft knock interrupted his writing. Thomas closed the journal and moved to the door, opening it cautiously. Elizabeth Wilson stood in the hallway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her gray hair tucked beneath a modest bonnet. Dr. Harrington, I apologize for the late hour, but I must speak with you. Thomas stepped back, gesturing her inside. Mrs. Wilson, please come in. Elizabeth entered, her hands clasped tightly before her. I won't stay long. It isn't proper for me to be in a gentleman's room at this hour, but this couldn't wait until morning. What's happened? Thomas asked, concern evident in his voice. It's Victoria. Elizabeth's eyes filled with worry. After that scene with Johnson today, Sheriff Caldwell has announced he's sending for a federal marshal. Says he's tired of waiting, that Victoria needs to be moved to a proper prison before vigilante justice takes over. Thomas frowned. That could be weeks away still. No, Elizabeth shook her head. Caldwell sent a telegram this afternoon. There's a marshal in Denver who will arrive within 3 days. Thomas absorbed this news, his mind racing. This changes things. I'll need to move more quickly than planned. Elizabeth studied him with newfound intensity. Who are you really, Dr. Harrington? Why have you come to Redemption Springs? Thomas hesitated, then moved to his satchel and withdrew Edward Blackwood's note. He handed it to Elizabeth. She read it, her eyes widening. Edward Blackwood wrote this to you. We served together briefly during the war, Thomas explained. I was the doctor who removed a bullet from his shoulder in '63. We weren't close, but in field hospitals, men often share their deepest fears with the doctors patching them up. And Edward feared for Victoria. Thomas nodded. He had premonitions of his own death. Kept saying he wouldn't survive the war, that Victoria would be alone. He made me promise to look after her if anything happened to him. Elizabeth returned the note. But the war ended 20 years ago. Why come now? I tried Mrs. Wilson, though. Thomas's face showed a flicker of old pain. I searched for Edward after the war, but records were chaotic. By the time I learned he had survived and settled out west, years had passed. Then my own life. He trailed off. I failed to keep my promise for too long. When I finally tracked Victoria to Redemption Springs 2 years ago, I learned she'd already been imprisoned. 2 years. Elizabeth's brow furrowed. You've known where she was for that long. I've been working to secure her release through legal channels, Thomas explained. Petitioning the territorial governor, appealing to the federal court. But the wheels of justice turn slowly, especially for a woman accused of killing 3 men. And in the meantime, she suffers. Elizabeth's voice held no accusation, only sadness. Yes. Thomas turned to the window, gazing out at the darkened square. I can't wait any longer. Not if the marshal is coming. What will you do? Thomas was silent for a long moment. Something desperate, he finally said. Something that may not work. But I have to try. Elizabeth nodded slowly. There's something you should know, Dr. Harrington. Something about Victoria that few in this town are aware of. She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. When she was arrested, Victoria was with child. Thomas turned sharply. What? Edward's child, Elizabeth confirmed. She was in the early stages, barely showing. Only Dr. Wilson and I knew. The child was born in that cage, Dr. Harrington. A little girl. Thomas felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath him. Born in the cage, dear God. What happened to the infant? Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. Sheriff Caldwell said a baby couldn't stay in a prison. He was going to send it to an orphanage in Denver. She straightened her shoulders. I couldn't allow that. I told him I would take the child, raise it as my own. You have Victoria's child, Thomas whispered, stunned. Her name is Hannah, Elizabeth said softly. She's beautiful, Dr. Harrington. She has her mother's eyes. Does Victoria know? She knows I took her, Elizabeth replied, but Caldwell forbade me from bringing the child to see her, said it would upset the prisoner. In truth, I think he feared what the town might feel if they saw a mother separated from her innocent child. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, overwhelmed by this revelation. A child, Edward's daughter. Does she know who her mother is? She's only 18 months old, Elizabeth said. But I show her Victoria's picture, a small daguerreotype Edward had made before he died. I tell her stories about her brave mama. She reached for Thomas's hand. Whatever you're planning, Dr. Harrington, please understand there's more at stake than just Victoria's freedom. There's a child who deserves to know her mother. Thomas nodded, his resolve hardening. Thank you for telling me this, Mrs. Wilson. It changes nothing and everything. Elizabeth moved toward the door. I should go. Hannah will wake if I'm gone too long. She paused, hand on the doorknob. Be careful, Doctor. Sheriff Caldwell is not a man to cross lightly. I've faced worse men than Caldwell, Thomas said quietly. After Elizabeth left, Thomas returned to the window. In the moonlight, he could just make out the silhouette of the steel cage in the square. Victoria would be sleeping now, or trying to sleep on the hard platform that had been her bed for 2 years. 2 years of captivity. 2 years separated from her child. Thomas's hand drifted to the scar on his neck, a reminder of another time he had faced seemingly impossible odds. He'd survived then through luck and the help of strangers. Perhaps it was time to repay that debt by becoming the stranger who helped someone else. He moved to his medical bag and opened it, checking its contents one final time. Then he reached beneath the bed and pulled out something he hadn't shown Elizabeth, a small leather pouch heavy with gold coins, his entire savings from years of work after the war. Hold on, Victoria, he murmured to the distant cage. Just a little longer. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, Victoria woke from fitful sleep to find a small folded piece of paper that had been pushed through the bars of her cage. She glanced around the empty square, seeing no one who might have left it. With fingers stiff from cold, she unfolded the note. Be ready. Tonight. Victoria stared at the 3 words, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. Be ready for what escape seemed impossible. The cage was solid, the lock massive. And even if Thomas somehow managed to free her, where would they go? The nearest town was 2 days' ride. Sheriff Caldwell would have a posse after them within hours. And yet, hope, that most dangerous of emotions, flickered to life within her chest. Hope that had been smothered for 2 long years. Victoria carefully tore the note into tiny pieces, letting them fall through the slats of the platform, to be lost in the mud below. Then she settled back into her habitual posture of patient endurance, betraying nothing of the storm brewing within. The town awakened around her. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Children trudged reluctantly to the small schoolhouse at the end of the street. The stage arrived with new travelers, none sparing more than a curious glance at the woman in the cage. Victoria watched it all with new awareness, noting details she had long since trained herself to ignore. The position of the sheriff's office relative to the cage, the patterns of the deputies' rounds, the blind spots where the alleys between buildings created shadows. If Thomas Harrington truly meant to attempt something as foolish as freeing her, she would be ready. Not because she believed he would succeed, but because, after 2 years of helplessness, the mere possibility of action was intoxicating. As the morning wore on, Victoria noticed something odd. Thomas hadn't appeared. Not at breakfast time, when he usually crossed the square on his way to the hotel dining room. Not mid-morning, when he typically visited Dr. Wilson's office. By noon, Victoria began to wonder if something had happened to him. Had Caldwell discovered his plans? Was Thomas even now languishing in a cell, paying the price for his intended kindness? Her questions were answered when Sheriff Caldwell himself sauntered across the square, stopping before her cage with a self-satisfied smile. Fine day, isn't it, Mrs. Blackwood? He said, rocking back on his heels. The kind of day that brings good news. Victoria regarded him silently, giving nothing away. Your admirer's leaving town, Caldwell continued, clearly enjoying himself. Dr. Harrington booked passage on the afternoon stage. Seems our little chat yesterday convinced him Redemption Springs isn't the place for him after all. Victoria's face remained impassive, though her heart sank. So Thomas had abandoned his plans. Whatever mad scheme he'd been contemplating, he'd thought better of it. She couldn't blame him. What obligation did he really have to her? A decades-old promise to a man long dead wasn't worth risking his life or freedom. Nothing to say, Caldwell prodded, and here I thought you two had become friendly. I have nothing to say to you, Sheriff, Victoria replied evenly. Today or any day. Caldwell's smile faded. Enjoy your high and mighty attitude while you can, Mrs. Blackwood. I got word this morning that Marshal Hayes will be here day after tomorrow. Then you'll be someone else's problem. He tipped his hat mockingly and walked away, leaving Victoria alone with the knowledge that her last fragile hope had been crushed. The afternoon dragged on, the sun arcing across the sky with agonizing slowness. Victoria watched the stage depart, unable to see if Thomas was indeed among its passengers. It didn't matter. He was gone or would be soon. The brief connection she'd felt, the first human contact that had meant anything in years, was severed. As evening approached, Victoria retreated into the mental sanctuary she had built during her long confinement. A place where steel bars couldn't reach, where she could walk freely through memories of happier times. Edward's smile, their small homestead outside of town, the garden where she had grown the herbs for her healing work, and newer memories more painful but precious, the weight of her daughter in her arms for the brief time she had been allowed to hold her. The perfect, tiny fingers, the wisps of golden hair, the eyes so like her own, staring up with unfocused wonder. Hannah. Elizabeth had named her Hannah after Edward's mother. A good name, a strong name. Victoria had given her child up without protest, knowing that a cage was no place for an infant, knowing that Elizabeth would love her, care for her, tell her the truth when she was old enough to understand. But oh, how it had broken something vital inside her to watch Elizabeth walk away with her baby, a wound deeper than any the cage had inflicted. Lost in these thoughts, Victoria barely registered the commotion at the far end of the street. Raised voices, the pounding of boots on wooden boardwalks, someone shouting about a fire at the livery stable. Men rushed past her cage, heading toward a plume of smoke now visible above the rooftops. Sheriff Caldwell among them, barking orders to form a bucket line. Victoria watched with detached interest. Fires were dangerous in frontier towns where wooden buildings stood shoulder to shoulder. The entire community would turn out to fight it, leaving the rest of the town deserted. Victoria straightened, suddenly alert. Was this Thomas's plan? Create a diversion to empty the square? The sound of boots on the platform made her turn. Thomas stood there no longer in his gentleman's clothes, but dressed as a common laborer, a bandana covering the lower half of his face. In his hand, he held what appeared to be a large metal tool. Stand back, he ordered, his voice muffled by the bandana. Victoria pressed herself against the far side of the cage as Thomas inserted the tool into the lock. It wasn't a key, but some kind of pry bar. He leveraged his weight against it, muscles straining beneath his rough shirt. The lock held. Thomas adjusted his position and tried again, the sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool evening air. Again, the lock resisted. It's no use, Victoria said quietly. Johnson forged it specially. Said it would hold the devil himself. Thomas paused, breathing hard. Then we try something else. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. Sheriff Caldwell. Victoria's heart froze. Was he calling for help? Had this been a trap all along? But Thomas wasn't looking toward the fire. His attention remained fixed on the cage as Sheriff Caldwell came running back toward them, hand on his gun. What in hell do you think you're doing? Caldwell demanded, skidding to a stop before the cage. Thomas lowered the bandana, revealing his face. Making a business proposition, Sheriff. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. Thought you left town, Doc. I booked passage, Thomas agreed, but I never got on the stage. You're trying to free a convicted murderer, Caldwell said, drawing his pistol. That's a hanging offense. I'm trying to right a wrong, Thomas replied calmly, and I'm willing to pay for the privilege. He tossed the leather pouch at Caldwell's feet. It landed with a heavy clink of metal on metal. The sheriff stared at it, then at Thomas. What's this? $500 in gold, Thomas said, for the release of Mrs. Blackwood into my custody. Victoria couldn't hide her shock. $500 was a fortune enough to buy a small ranch to start a new life somewhere far from Redemption Springs. Caldwell's expression shifted, greed warring with suspicion. You trying to bribe an officer of the law, Doc? Not at all, Thomas replied smoothly. I'm offering to take a problem off your hands. Mrs. Blackwood has served 2 years in conditions that would constitute cruel and unusual punishment in any proper court. The territorial governor might take an interest in that fact, especially if it were brought to his attention by someone with medical credentials. Caldwell's face darkened. That sounds like a threat. An observation, Thomas corrected. $500 is a lot of money, Sheriff. More than this town will see from charging gawkers $10 a touch for the next decade. Think what you could do with it. New schoolhouse, repairs to the church, or perhaps some personal investments. Victoria watched the calculation in Caldwell's eyes. The sheriff was corrupt. She had known that from the beginning. But was he corrupt enough to sell her freedom? Even if I was inclined to accept, Caldwell said slowly, what's to stop me from taking your money and arresting you both anyway, or just shooting you as an escaped prisoner and her accomplice? Because I've written letters, Thomas said, detailed accounts of everything I've observed in Redemption Springs. The conditions, the lack of proper trial, Mrs. Blackwood's child born in captivity and taken from her. His gaze hardened. Those letters will find their way to the territorial governor and several newspaper editors if anything happens to either of us. Caldwell's grip on his pistol tightened. For a long moment, Victoria thought he might shoot Thomas where he stood. Then unexpectedly, the sheriff laughed. Well played, Doc. Well played. He holstered his weapon and bent to retrieve the pouch, weighing it in his hand. 500, you say? Count it if you like, Thomas offered. Caldwell opened the pouch, pouring a few coins into his palm. They gleamed in the fading light, undeniably real. He returned them to the pouch and tucked it into his vest pocket. Deal, he said simply. Then he reached for the ring of keys at his belt. But you'd best be gone by morning, both of you, and don't ever show your faces in Redemption Springs again. Victoria could scarcely believe what was happening as Caldwell unlocked the cage door. It swung open with a creak of hinges long unused. Go on, Caldwell said, gesturing impatiently, before I change my mind, or before Johnson gets back from the fire and decides to string you both up regardless. Victoria hesitated, staring at the open door. After 2 years, freedom seemed unreal, a dream from which she would soon awake to find herself still caged. Victoria, Thomas said softly, extending his hand. It's time to go. Slowly, Victoria moved forward. Her legs trembled beneath her, unused to walking more than the 3 steps her cage had allowed. As she reached the door, she paused, looking back at the small space that had been her entire world for 2 years. Then she took Thomas's hand and stepped out of the cage. The sensation was overwhelming, space opening around her, the absence of bars, the feeling of evening air against her face without the interference of steel. Victoria swayed slightly and Thomas's arm came around her waist to steady her. I've got you, he murmured. You're free now. Sheriff Caldwell watched them with an unreadable expression. The fire won't keep everyone occupied much longer, he warned. I were you, I'd be on the road within the hour. Thomas nodded. We will be. Just one more thing. He fixed Caldwell with a hard stare. Mrs. Wilson. She has something that belongs to Mrs. Blackwood. Caldwell's jaw tightened. The brat stays here. No, Victoria's voice was stronger than she had expected. My daughter comes with us. That wasn't part of our deal, Caldwell protested. It is now, Thomas said firmly, or perhaps those letters should find their way to the governor after all. For a moment it seemed Caldwell might reach for his gun again. Then he cursed under his breath. Fine, take the child, but be quick about it. Victoria's heart soared. Hannah. She would see Hannah again, hold her daughter after so long. Can you walk? Thomas asked her quietly. Victoria nodded, though her legs still felt unsteady. Yes, take me to my child. Together they moved away from the cage, leaving Sheriff Caldwell standing beside the empty prison. Victoria didn't look back. Her gaze was fixed forward toward the small parsonage beside the church where her daughter waited. Toward freedom. Toward a future she had thought forever lost. Thank you, she whispered to Thomas as they walked. Why would you do this for me? Thomas glanced down at her, his eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. I made a promise, he said simply, to Edward and to myself. Victoria studied his face, seeing in it not just kindness, but a deeper understanding, the recognition of one wounded soul for another. Edward would be grateful, she said softly. Thomas's expression held a flicker of something unreadable. I hope so, he replied. I truly hope so. As they approached the parsonage, a light glowed in the window, a beacon guiding Victoria home to the child she had never thought to hold again. With each step, the cage receded further behind her, its shadow growing fainter as night fell over Redemption Springs. For the first time in 2 years, Victoria Blackwood allowed herself to hope that tomorrow might be better than today. And for the first time in 22 years, Thomas Harrington felt the weight of an old promise begin to lift from his shoulders. The true journey for both of them was just beginning. The parsonage stood like a humble sentinel beside the white-steepled church, its windows glowing with warm lamplight against the gathering darkness. Victoria's steps faltered as they approached the small porch. After 2 years in a cage, the prospect of entering a proper home, of seeing her child, overwhelmed her senses. Are you all right? Thomas asked, his hand still supporting her elbow. Victoria nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She had imagined this moment countless times during her imprisonment, walking free, reclaiming her daughter. But the reality struck deeper than any dream. Thomas knocked softly on the door. Moments later it opened to reveal Elizabeth Wilson, her kind face registering first shock, then understanding as she took in the pair before her. You did it, she whispered, stepping back to let them enter. Come in quickly before anyone sees you. The warmth and familiar sense of a living home wood smoke, baking bread, lavender sachets washed over Victoria as she crossed the threshold. The modest parlor with its faded furniture and handmade quilts seemed impossibly luxurious after 2 years of steel and splinters. Where is she? Victoria asked, her voice barely audible. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. Sleeping. I've just put her down. She gestured toward a door at the back of the parlor. Would you like to see her? Victoria could only nod, her heart thundering in her chest. Elizabeth led them to a small bedroom where a child's crib stood beside a narrow bed. A single candle burned on the nightstand, casting gentle shadows across the sleeping form of a toddler, with golden curls splayed across the pillow. Victoria froze in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a sob. Hannah had been a tiny newborn when last she'd held her, red-faced and squalling. Now she was a little person, cheeks flushed with sleep, one small hand curled beside her face. She's beautiful, Thomas murmured beside her. Victoria approached the crib with reverent steps, afraid that this miraculous vision might vanish if she moved too quickly. She reached out a trembling hand to touch her daughter's hair, as soft as goose down beneath her roughened fingers. Hannah stirred at the touch, her small brow furrowing. Then her eyes opened, startling blue mirror images of Victoria's own, and she regarded the stranger above her with sleepy curiosity. Hello, Hannah, Victoria whispered, tears streaming freely down her face now. I'm your mama. The child blinked, then reached up a pudgy hand toward Victoria's face, drawn perhaps by the glint of tears in the candlelight. Victoria lifted her daughter into her arms, the weight of her both strange and familiar. Hannah didn't cry or struggle, as might be expected with a stranger. Instead, she settled against Victoria's chest with a contented sigh, as though some deeper memory recognized the heartbeat she had once known from within. Thomas and Elizabeth retreated to the parlor, leaving mother and daughter to their reunion. Victoria sank into the rocking chair beside the crib, cradling Hannah close, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. For the first time in 2 years, the knot of grief and rage that had sustained her through captivity began to unravel, replaced by something warmer and more fragile. "I thought I'd lost you forever," she murmured against her daughter's curls. "I never thought I'd hold you again." Hannah yawned and nestled closer, accepting Victoria's presence with the simple trust of childhood. Victoria began to rock gently, humming a lullaby that Edward had once sung to her during their brief, precious years together. In the parlor, Thomas spoke urgently with Elizabeth. "We need to leave tonight," he explained. "Before word spreads that Victoria is free. Caldwell might have accepted the bribe, but I don't trust him to keep his end of the bargain for long." Elizabeth nodded, her practical nature asserting itself through her emotion. "I've packed a bag for Hannah, clothes, her favorite blanket, a few toys. She's too young to understand what's happening, but familiar things will comfort her." "Thank you," Thomas said with genuine gratitude, "for everything you've done for them both. I only wish I could have done more." Elizabeth's eyes drifted to the bedroom door. Victoria deserved justice, not imprisonment, and Hannah deserved to know her mother from the beginning. "They'll have each other now," Thomas assured her. "I've arranged for a wagon at the edge of town. We'll travel through the night, reach the next county by morning. I have connections there who can help us disappear until I can secure proper legal exoneration for Victoria." Elizabeth studied him with renewed curiosity. "You've planned this thoroughly." "I've had 2 years to think about it," Thomas admitted, "though I'd hoped for a less dramatic resolution through legal channels." "And after," Elizabeth asked, "what happens when Victoria is truly free? What role do you see for yourself then?" "Dr. Harrington." Thomas's expression grew guarded. "That will be for Victoria to decide. My obligation is to see her and Hannah safely established, nothing more." "Obligation," Elizabeth repeated softly. "Is that all it is?" Before Thomas could respond, Victoria emerged from the bedroom with Hannah sleeping against her shoulder. The transformation in her was remarkable. Her face softened, her eyes bright with purpose rather than the dull resignation that had marked her for so long. "She fell back asleep," Victoria whispered, stroking her daughter's back. "She doesn't know me, but she isn't afraid." "Children sense more than we give them credit for," Elizabeth said, smiling through tears. "And I've shown her your picture every day. Told her stories about her brave, beautiful mama." Victoria's eyes met Elizabeth's. "I can never repay you for what you've done. Love her, that's payment enough." Elizabeth moved to a small trunk near the door. "I've packed her things. Not much, but what she'll need." She hesitated, then added, "I've included something for you as well. Some of your old dresses that I saved after they took you. And Edward's pocket watch. I managed to retrieve it before they sold off your belongings." Victoria swallowed hard. "Elizabeth?" "No more thanks," the older woman interrupted gently. "You need to go. Now, while the town is still distracted by the fire." Thomas lifted the trunk, surprisingly light for all it contained, the material remnants of 2 lives. "Mrs. Wilson, you should know that when our departure is discovered, Sheriff Caldwell may suspect your involvement." Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. "Let him. I've faced worse than Thaddeus Caldwell in my time. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I'm the pastor's widow. There are limits to what even he will do in this God-fearing town." They made their farewells quickly, Victoria embracing Elizabeth with her free arm, while Hannah slumbered on between them. Then they slipped out the back door of the parsonage into the garden that bordered the church cemetery. Thomas led them along a path that skirted the edge of town, avoiding the main streets where townspeople were still battling the livery stable fire. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, and shouts echoed in the distance. "Your diversion?" Victoria asked quietly as they hurried through the shadows. Thomas nodded. "Hay and a little coal oil in an empty stall. Enough to create smoke and flames, but not enough to destroy the building or harm the horses." He glanced at her. "I'm not proud of it, but I needed time." "To bribe the sheriff," Victoria finished. "Yes." Thomas adjusted his grip on the trunk, though I'd have preferred to see him face justice himself. They walked in silence for a time, Victoria adapting to the strange freedom of open space after so long confined. Her legs ached from the unaccustomed exercise, but she pushed through the discomfort, focusing on the precious weight of Hannah in her arms. At the edge of town, where the last scattered houses gave way to open country, a covered wagon waited beside a stand of cottonwoods. A pair of sturdy horses stood in harnesses, occasionally stamping a hoof in the darkness. "Your carriage, Mrs. Blackwood," Thomas said with a hint of gallows humor. He helped Victoria and Hannah into the wagon bed, which had been fitted with blankets and pillows to create a makeshift bed. Then he secured the trunk and climbed onto the driver's seat, taking up the reins. "Try to get some rest," he advised. "We have a long journey ahead." Victoria settled Hannah beside her, tucking blankets around the still sleeping child. As the wagon lurched into motion, she found herself fighting a sudden irrational panic. The open sky above the moving landscape around them after 2 years of enforced stillness, even this gentle movement felt overwhelming. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe evenly. Freedom. This was freedom. The terror would pass. The wagon rolled through the night following a little-used trail that wound through hills thick with pine and aspen. Thomas drove steadily, pausing occasionally to rest the horses and check their back trail for signs of pursuit. Victoria dozed fitfully, waking at every sound: the call of an owl, the distant howl of wolves, the creak of the wagon itself. Hannah slept the deep, untroubled sleep of childhood, stirring only to nestle closer to her mother's warmth. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Thomas pulled the wagon into a sheltered hollow beside a small stream. He jumped down from the driver's seat and came around to the back. "We should rest here for a few hours," he said quietly. "The horses need it, and so do you." Victoria nodded, her eyes gritty with exhaustion. She hadn't truly slept, not the deep healing sleep her body craved after years of vigilant half-slumber in the cage. Thomas busied himself with the horses, removing their harness and leading them to drink from the stream. When he returned, he carried a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Breakfast," he explained, setting it on the wagon bed. "Nothing fancy, I'm afraid. Bread, cheese, some dried apples." Victoria unwrapped the food, the simple fare appearing luxurious after the thin gruel and stale bread that had constituted her diet in captivity. As she ate, Hannah began to stir, waking with the soft whimpers of a child in an unfamiliar place. "Mama," the little girl called, her voice small and uncertain. "Mama? Lisbeth?" Victoria froze bread halfway to her mouth. Of course Hannah would call for Elizabeth, the only mother she had ever known. The reality of what they had done, taking a child from the only home she remembered, struck Victoria with sudden force. "It's all right, little one," she soothed, reaching for her daughter. "Elizabeth had to stay behind, but I'm here. Your mama is here." Hannah regarded Victoria with solemn blue eyes, clearly trying to reconcile this stranger with the woman Elizabeth had told her about. Finally, she reached out a tentative hand to touch Victoria's cheek as she had the night before. "Mama?" she asked, this time with a different inflection, a question rather than a call. "Yes," Victoria whispered, her heart so full it hurt. "Yes, I'm your mama." Hannah seemed to accept this, though confusion still clouded her small face. She turned her attention to Thomas, who had been watching the exchange with quiet intensity. "Who dat?" she asked, pointing at him. Victoria hesitated, unsure how to explain Thomas's presence to a child too young to understand complex relationships. "A friend," Thomas answered for her, smiling gently at Hannah. "My name is Thomas." Hannah studied him with the frank curiosity of early childhood. "Thomas," she repeated carefully. Then, with the mercurial attention span of a toddler, she spotted the food. "Hungry." The simple normality of the moment, a child asking for breakfast, struck Victoria with unexpected poignancy. She had missed so many such moments, so many firsts in her daughter's life. First smile, first word, first steps. They were gone forever, existing only in Elizabeth's memories now. As if sensing her thoughts, Thomas said quietly, "You have time for new memories, Victoria, years of them." She looked up, startled by his perceptiveness. "If we're not caught, we won't be, he assured her with more confidence than perhaps he felt. "Redemption Springs is behind us now. By the time Caldwell realizes he's been duped, we'll be well beyond his reach." Victoria wanted to believe him. But 2 years in a cage had taught her that justice was a fragile thing, easily broken by men with power and grudges. They shared the simple meal, Hannah warming quickly to Victoria once food was involved. The child's resilience was remarkable, though she occasionally asked for Lisbeth. She seemed content enough with Victoria's explanations that they would see her again someday. After eating, Thomas suggested they all try to sleep, while daylight made pursuit difficult. He spread his bedroll beneath the wagon, giving Victoria and Hannah privacy within. Exhausted beyond measure, Victoria finally surrendered to sleep with Hannah curled trustingly against her side. Her last conscious thought was wonder at how quickly life could change from a prisoner with no hope to a mother with a future, all in the space of a single night. She dreamed of Edward for the first time in months, not the Edward of her usual nightmares, pale and wasting with illness, but the strong, laughing man she had first fallen in love with. In the dream, he stood beside a mountain stream, smiling at her. "You found her," he said, though she couldn't tell if he was speaking to her or to someone else. "Thank you for keeping your promise." Victoria woke with a start to find the sun high overhead and Hannah playing quietly beside her with a small wooden doll Elizabeth had packed. For a disorienting moment, Victoria couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back, the bribe, the escape, the wagon. Freedom. She sat up, pushing aside the blankets. Thomas was nowhere to be seen, and momentary panic gripped her. Had he abandoned them? Then she heard voices from the other side of the wagon, Thomas speaking with someone. Victoria tensed, reaching instinctively for Hannah. "Appreciate the warning, Samuel," Thomas was saying. "How far behind us?" "Half a day, maybe less," replied a younger voice Victoria didn't recognize. "Johnson's leading them. Got about 10 men all armed. Caldwell tried to stop them from what I heard. Said the witch wasn't worth dying over." "But Johnson wouldn't listen," Thomas guessed. "No, sir. Not after he found out about the fire being set deliberate like. He's out for blood now. Victoria's heart sank. She had known it wouldn't be so simple. The hatred that had kept her caged for 2 years wouldn't dissolve overnight, bribe or no bribe. She rose carefully, settling Hannah with her doll, and moved to the edge of the wagon to listen. "They're following the main road west," the unknown voice continued. "Figure you'd make for the territorial border." "Good," Thomas said. "We're heading north to Silverton. I have friends there." "Might work," the other man said doubtfully. "But Johnson's no fool. He'll figure out you doubled back eventually. By then we'll be somewhere else." There was a rustle of paper. "Here for your trouble and your silence. Don't need paying to help Mrs. Blackwood doc. My boy would have died of the fever if not for her medicines. Some of us ain't forgot that." Victoria peeked around the edge of the wagon cover. Thomas stood with a young man she vaguely recognized as one of the stable hands from Redemption Springs, Samuel apparently. The young man tucked something into his pocket, presumably payment, despite his protest. "One more thing," Samuel said, lowering his voice. "There's talk that the marshal's still coming. Caldwell sent a second telegram yesterday before all this happened. Said he was washing his hands of the whole business, but the marshal should still come collect the prisoner." Thomas nodded grimly. "All the more reason to keep moving." "Thank you, Samuel. You've taken a risk coming here." "Just evening the scales a bit, sir." Samuel touched the brim of his hat. "Good luck to you both, and to the little one." As Samuel mounted his horse and rode away, Victoria emerged fully from the wagon. Thomas turned at the sound of her movement. "You heard?" he asked. Victoria nodded. "Johnson and his men are coming for us." "They're looking in the wrong direction," Thomas said with forced confidence. "By the time they realize their mistake, we'll be in Silverton." "And then," Victoria asked, "the marshal is still coming. We'll be fugitives, Thomas. You've thrown away your life, your reputation to free a woman convicted of murder." Thomas's expression hardened. "You were never properly convicted, Victoria, and I haven't thrown away anything I value." He moved to check the horse's harness. "We should leave. There's a hunting cabin about 4 hours north of here. We can rest there tonight, then push on to Silverton tomorrow." Victoria wanted to press further to understand why this man had risked everything for a promise made decades ago, but Hannah called from the wagon hungry again, and the moment passed. They traveled through the afternoon, the wagon jolting over increasingly rough terrain as Thomas led them away from established trails. Victoria sat in the back with Hannah telling her stories and singing softly to distract the child from the discomfort of travel. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they came to a small clearing where a crude log cabin stood beside a tumbling mountain stream. The cabin's roof sagged in the middle, and its single window was covered with oiled paper rather than glass, but it offered solid walls and a door that could be barred luxury compared to Victoria's recent accommodations. Thomas helped Victoria and Hannah down from the wagon, then unhitched the horses. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it should be safe for tonight." Victoria surveyed the humble structure with gratitude rather than disappointment. "It has a roof and walls. After 2 years in a cage open to every storm, that's more than enough." The cabin's interior was simple, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 three-legged stools, and a narrow cot pushed against one wall. Dust and pine needles covered the plank floor, and spiderwebs draped the ceiling corners. "An old patient of mine uses it for hunting trips," Thomas explained as he set down the trunk. "He won't mind us borrowing it." Victoria set Hannah on her feet, letting the toddler explore the new space while she brushed away the worst of the dust from the cot. "You have patients in these parts?" she asked. "I thought you said you were no longer practicing medicine." Thomas busied himself with starting a fire in the hearth. "I retired from formal practice after the war," he said, his back to her. "Too many memories, but I still help where I can." "Yet you introduced yourself as a doctor in Redemption Springs." "It's useful sometimes," he admitted. "People trust doctors. They answer questions they might otherwise avoid." Victoria watched him work, noting the efficiency of his movements, the careful way he built the fire to produce maximum heat with minimum smoke. This was a man accustomed to caution, to living on the edges of society. "Who are you really, Thomas Harrington?" she asked softly. His hand stilled momentarily. Then he continued arranging kindling as though she hadn't spoken. "You knew Edward," Victoria persisted. "That much I believe, but there's more you're not telling me." Thomas sat back on his heels as the fire caught flames licking upward through the carefully stacked wood. For a long moment he stared into the growing blaze. Then he sighed and turned to face her. "You're right," he admitted. "There's more, but it's a long story and not all of it reflects well on me." "We have time," Victoria said, settling on one of the stools. Hannah had discovered a family of mice living in the corner and was watching them with fascinated silence, momentarily content. Thomas nodded, his expression somber. "I did know Edward, though not well. I was a field surgeon during the war. One night after a particularly bloody battle, they brought in a young soldier with a shoulder wound. Edward Blackwood." Victoria's throat tightened at the mention of her husband's name. She remembered all too well his stories of the war, though he had spoken of them rarely and only in the darkest hours of night. "The wound itself wasn't mortal," Thomas continued, "but infection had set in. Fever, delirium. I did what I could, remove the bullet fragments, clean the wound. But in those conditions, with so many wounded..." He trailed off the memories, clearly painful. He wasn't expected to survive the night. But he did, Victoria said. He came home to me. Thomas nodded. Yes, against all odds he lived. But that night when I told him his chances were poor, he made me promise something. He reached into his shirt and withdrew a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. He wrote this, said if he died, I should find his wife you and make sure you were all right. He handed the paper to Victoria. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it, recognizing immediately the bold slanting script of her husband. If anything happens to me, find Victoria. She'll need a friend when I'm gone. Edward Blackwood, 1863. Victoria traced the words with her fingertip, feeling the indentations in the paper where Edward had pressed his pen. A message from beyond the grave, a connection to the man she had loved and lost. He lived, she said again, looking up at Thomas. He came home. Why keep this? Why honor a promise made under such circumstances? Thomas reclaimed the paper, refolding it with careful reverence. Because I gave my word, and because, he hesitated, because I failed him in other ways. Victoria sensed they were approaching the heart of the matter, the secret Thomas had been keeping. How did you fail him? Thomas moved to the cabin's single window, staring out at the gathering dusk. After the war, I tried to forget, to put the blood and death behind me. I drank too much, moved from town to town. It was years before I thought to look for Edward to see if he had survived after all. He turned back to face her, his expression haunted. When I finally did search for him, I learned he had indeed lived, had married a woman named Victoria, had settled in Colorado Territory. A muscle worked in his jaw. I should have come then. Should have told him I was glad he survived, but I was ashamed of what I'd become. So I put it off, another month, another year. Hannah abandoned the mice and toddled over to Victoria, who lifted the child onto her lap. Then I read about Edward's death in a Denver newspaper, Thomas continued. A brief mention, a respected veteran, survived by his wife. And I knew I had failed to keep my promise, failed even to thank the man whose survival had seemed so miraculous. Victoria stroked Hannah's curls, remembering those dark days after Edward's passing. The lonely homestead, the gradual suspicion from neighbors who had never quite trusted her healing practices. Then the night at the saloon, the attack, the killings. So you came to find me, she said, out of obligation to a dead man. At first, yes, Thomas admitted. But when I reached Redemption Springs 2 years ago and learned what had happened to you, his voice hardened. I saw the cage, saw how they treated you, and it became something more than obligation. Victoria's head came up sharply. 2 years ago, you've known where I was for 2 years. Thomas had the grace to look at him. Yes, I tried legal channels first, petitioned the territorial governor, appealed to the federal court, wrote to newspapers. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. No one cared about a woman convicted of killing 3 men, no matter the circumstances, no matter the inhumanity of her punishment. So you gave up, Victoria said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. 2 years in that cage while this man had known, had supposedly tried to help. No, Thomas's voice was fierce. I never gave up. I saved every dollar I earned, made connections with people who could help us disappear, studied the town, the sheriff, the routines. He took a step toward her, his eyes intent. I was planning your escape from the moment I saw you in that cage, Victoria. But I wanted it to be done right, to give you a real chance at freedom, not just a few days on the run before being captured again. Victoria wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this man had spent 2 years working toward her freedom. But the pain of those years was still too raw, the memory of each rain-soaked night, each blistering summer day, each moment of humiliation as townspeople stared and children threw stones. You could have come to me, she said quietly, spoken to me, let me know I wasn't entirely abandoned. Regret crossed Thomas's face. You're right, I should have, but I was afraid my presence would draw attention, make your situation worse. He rubbed a hand over his face. I convinced myself it was better to work from the shadows until everything was in place. I was wrong. Hannah squirmed in Victoria's lap, sensing the tension between the adults. Victoria soothed her automatically, her mind churning with conflicting emotions, gratitude for her freedom, anger at the delay, confusion about Thomas's true motives. There's something else, she said suddenly, a realization dawning. Something you're still not telling me. Thomas's expression closed like a door being shut. We should eat, he said, turning away. It's been a long day and tomorrow will be longer. Victoria set Hannah down, rising to her feet. No more evasions, Thomas. If we're to trust each other, if I'm to place my life and my daughter's in your hands, I need the whole truth. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. Then his shoulders slumped slightly, the rigid posture of a soldier giving way to the weariness of a man carrying a heavy burden. You're right, he said again, not looking at her. There is more. He took a deep breath. I was with Edward when he died. Victoria felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. What? That's impossible. Edward died at our homestead of fever. Thomas finally turned to face her, his expression ravaged by old guilt. No, Victoria. Edward didn't die of natural causes. He was poisoned. The cabin seemed to spin around Victoria. She groped blindly for the stool behind her, sinking onto it as her legs threatened to give way. Poisoned by whom? By men who wanted him silenced, Thomas said grimly. Men who knew he had discovered something they needed to keep hidden. Victoria shook her head, struggling to comprehend. I don't understand. Edward was a farmer, a veteran trying to build a quiet life. What could he possibly have known that would get him killed? Thomas moved to the fire, adding another log, although the blaze was already adequate. Victoria recognized the action for what it was, a delay, a moment to gather thoughts. After the war, he began. Edward worked briefly as a land surveyor for the territorial government. During that time, he discovered irregularities in certain mining claims registered to Sheriff Caldwell and Judge Reynolds, among others. Victoria's mind raced, trying to reconcile this new information with what she had believed for years. Caldwell, but he wasn't sheriff of Redemption Springs when Edward died. We didn't even live in that town then. No, but he was a deputy in the county seat, Thomas explained, working his way up building connections. The judge was already powerful with investments throughout the territory. He stared into the flames. Edward found evidence that they were filing false claims, pushing legitimate miners off their land, using threat of law to steal what wasn't theirs. And they killed him for this. Victoria's voice rose in disbelief, causing Hannah to look up from her play with wide eyes. Thomas nodded solemnly. Edward was an honest man. He was gathering evidence, planning to take it to the territorial governor. They couldn't allow that. Victoria pressed a hand to her mouth, memories shifting and realigning. The sudden onset of Edward's illness, the strange taste he had complained of in his coffee the morning he fell ill, the convenient arrival of Deputy Caldwell to help when word spread of Edward's condition. You said you were with him, she whispered. How? Where? Thomas's face reflected old pain. I'd finally tracked him down, was coming to fulfill my promise to check on him, ironic since he'd survived while so many others hadn't. I arrived at your homestead just as Caldwell was leaving. Found Edward already near death. Victoria remembered now a stranger arriving as Edward lay dying, claiming to be a doctor passing through. She had been so distraught, so focused on her husband's suffering, that she had barely registered the man's presence. Had certainly never connected him to the Thomas Harrington who appeared in Redemption Springs 2 years later. He recognized me, Thomas continued, even in his pain, asked if I'd kept my promise. His voice grew rough with emotion. I told him I was there to keep it now. He tried to tell me about the claims, the evidence he'd gathered, but it was too late. The poison had done its work. Why didn't you tell me this then? Victoria demanded, anger flaring through her shock. Why let me believe for years that he died of natural causes? Because Caldwell was watching the house, Thomas replied. Because Edward, with his dying breath, made me promise to protect you first, then expose their crimes. Evidence in the cellar, he said, but when I went to look later, it was gone. Victoria's mind whirled with implications. Caldwell took it, while I was sitting with Edward's body preparing him for burial. Thomas nodded grimly. I believe so. And once the evidence was gone, it would have been my word against theirs. A drifter, a former army doctor with a reputation for drinking against respected officials of the territory. So you left, Victoria said flatly. Left me alone to face what came after. I thought you would be safe, Thomas said, remorse heavy in his voice. They had what they wanted, the evidence destroyed, Edward silenced. I never imagined they would continue to persecute you. He ran a hand through his hair. By the time I learned what had happened in Redemption Springs, you were already in that cage. Victoria sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb the enormity of what Thomas had revealed. Edward murdered, a conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of local government, and her own imprisonment not just the result of defending herself against 3 drunken men, but part of a larger pattern of silencing the Blackwood family. The men in the saloon, she said slowly, the ones I killed, they weren't just random attackers, were they? I don't think so, Thomas confirmed. Frank Johnson was Caldwell's cousin. The others were known associates. I believe they were sent to intimidate you, perhaps drive you out of the territory. When that went wrong, they used it as an excuse to lock me away, Victoria finished, where I couldn't ask questions about Edward's death or continue his work. A bitter laugh escaped her, and I played right into their hands. I was so lost in grief, so angry. I never questioned why those particular men targeted me that night. Hannah had grown restless, sensing the distress in her mother's voice. She tugged at Victoria's skirt, whimpering softly. Victoria lifted her daughter, automatically cradling the child against her chest, as though the innocent weight could anchor her against the storm of revelations. I'm sorry, Thomas said, the words painfully inadequate for the magnitude of his disclosure. I should have told you everything from the beginning. Victoria stared at him, seeing now the burden he had carried all these years. The guilt, the sense of failure, the desperate need to make amends. Whatever his flaws, whatever his mistakes, Thomas Harrington had devoted years of his life to righting the wrong done to her family. Why tell me now? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Thomas met her gaze directly. Because you deserve the truth. Because if we're caught, you should know why Caldwell wants you silenced so badly. And because, he hesitated, because I'm tired of living with secrets between us. The simple honesty of this last statement struck Victoria more deeply than she expected. They had known each other only days yet were bound together by threads stretching back decades by Edward's life and death, by promises made and broken and renewed. "What do we do now?" she asked the practical question grounding her amid the emotional tumult. "We continue to Silverton," Thomas replied. "I have friends there, people who oppose the corrupt officials in this territory who can help us gather new evidence against Caldwell and Reynolds." His expression hardened with determination. "We'll clear your name, Victoria, and we'll bring Edward's killers to justice." Victoria looked down at Hannah, now drowsing against her shoulder, innocent of the weight of history and hatred that had shaped her young life. Whatever came next, Victoria's priority had to be protecting her child, giving Hannah the chance for a life untainted by the darkness that had engulfed her parents. "Very well," she said, decision crystallizing within her. "We'll go to Silverton. We'll seek justice." She fixed Thomas with a steady gaze. "But no more secrets, Thomas. No more truths withheld for my supposed protection. If we do this, we do it as equals." Thomas held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "As equals," he agreed. "No more secrets." Outside, the wind had risen, moaning through the pine trees surrounding the cabin. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the rough walls. Victoria felt suspended between past and future, the cage behind her, an uncertain road ahead, and between them this moment of terrible clarity. Edward had been murdered. His killers had orchestrated her imprisonment, and the man who now offered salvation had his own complicated role in the tragedy that had unfolded. Could she trust Thomas Harrington? Perhaps not entirely. But in the wilderness of southwestern Colorado, with a posse on their trail and a child to protect, trust was a luxury as scarce as justice itself. For now, they would continue their journey, and Victoria would watch and wait and guard both her heart and her daughter with equal vigilance. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the mountain cabin. Victoria woke to find Hannah already up, sitting on the floor beside Thomas as he showed her how to tie a simple knot in a piece of string. The domestic tableau struck Victoria with unexpected force, her daughter, who had never known a father's presence, looking up at Thomas with trusting eyes. "Good morning," Thomas said, noticing Victoria's wakefulness. "We let you sleep. You needed it." Victoria sat up, smoothing her tangled hair. "Thank you," she smiled at Hannah. "Has she been good?" "Perfect," Thomas assured her. "We've been getting acquainted. She's quite advanced for her age, you know. Speaks more clearly than most children twice as old." Pride swelled in Victoria's chest, though she had no right to claim credit for her daughter's development. "Elizabeth is a good teacher," she said, acknowledging the debt they owed the pastor's widow. They shared a simple breakfast of the remaining provisions Thomas had packed. As they ate, he outlined their plan for the day. "It's about 15 miles to Silverton," he explained. "Rough country, but the wagon can make it if we take it slow. We should arrive on late afternoon." "And your friends there?" Victoria asked. "They're expecting us." Thomas hesitated. "Not exactly, but they'll help us once I explain the situation." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "More secrets, Thomas." He had the grace to look abashed. "Not secrets, just complications I'd rather explain once to everyone involved." At her skeptical expression, he added, "I promise no more secrets about your situation, Victoria. And I've kept that promise. But my past has its own entanglements." Victoria decided not to press further for now. They had more immediate concerns: reaching Silverton, safely evading Johnson and his posse, establishing a secure place for Hannah. They packed quickly, erasing all signs of their presence in the cabin. As Thomas hitched the horses to the wagon, Victoria took a moment to stand in the clearing, breathing the clean mountain air, feeling the sun on her face without the interference of steel bars. Simple pleasures that she had been denied for so long. "Ready," Thomas called, helping Hannah up into the wagon. Victoria nodded, turning away from the momentary peace to face the uncertain journey ahead. "Ready." The trail to Silverton proved even rougher than Thomas had suggested, winding through steep ravines and across tumbling streams swollen with spring snowmelt. The wagon creaked alarmingly on the worst stretches, forcing them to proceed at a crawl. Victoria held Hannah securely as they bounced over the rugged terrain, telling stories to distract the increasingly fretful child. Tales of brave princesses and clever healers, of mountains with hearts of silver and streams that sang in the night. Imaginary worlds far removed from cages and conspiracies. By mid-afternoon, they had climbed high enough to see the valley where Silverton nestled among towering peaks, still capped with snow. The mining town sprawled along the valley floor, a collection of wooden buildings dominated by the tall structures of stamp mills where ore was crushed for processing. "It's grown since I was last here," Thomas observed as they began the long descent into the valley. The silver strike must have been as rich as they claimed. Victoria studied the town with a mixture of hope and apprehension. After so long in captivity, the prospect of being among crowds of strangers was daunting. Yet Silverton represented safety, a chance to disappear among the constantly shifting population of a mining boomtown. They were halfway down the trail when Thomas suddenly pulled the wagon to a halt, his body tensing as he scanned the path ahead. "What is it?" Victoria asked, instantly alert to danger. "Riders," Thomas said quietly, "coming up from town." Victoria peered down the trail but could see nothing through the screen of pine trees. Johnson's men. Unlikely they could have gotten ahead of us, Thomas replied, though his hand moved to the rifle stowed beneath the seat. Still best to be cautious. He guided the wagon off the trail into a small clearing sheltered by aspens, their new spring leaves trembling in the afternoon breeze. Stay here with Hannah, he instructed, taking the rifle. I'll see who's coming. Victoria wanted to protest but knew he was right. If there was danger, Hannah's safety had to come first. She gathered her daughter close, whispering reassurances to the child who sensed the sudden tension. Thomas disappeared down the trail, moving with the quiet efficiency Victoria had noticed before the habits of a man accustomed to danger. She waited, counting heartbeats, straining to hear any sound above the whisper of leaves and Hannah's soft breathing. Minutes stretched endlessly. Then came the sound of horses approaching, men's voices raised in conversation. Victoria tensed, ready to flee into the forest if necessary, but it was Thomas who appeared first, walking backward up the trail, rifle lowered but still in his hands. Behind him came 4 riders, rough-looking men in the practical clothing of miners or prospectors, their faces weathered by sun and wind. It's all right, Victoria, Thomas called. These are friends. Something in his hesitation made Victoria wary, but she remained where she was, one arm still protectively around Hannah. The riders dismounted at the edge of the clearing, regarding Victoria with undisguised curiosity. The tallest of them, a man with a gray-streaked beard and eyes sharp as a hawk's, stepped forward. So it's true, he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. You broke her out. He turned to Thomas. Caldwell's put a bounty on both your heads. $500 dead or alive. Victoria's blood ran cold. Dead or alive. After everything, they were now officially fugitives with a price on their heads. Victoria, Thomas said, moving to stand beside her. This is Jeremiah Collins, former federal marshal now. He hesitated. Now someone who believes in actual justice. Collins finished for him. Me and the boys have been waiting for you, Doc. Got word from your friend in Redemption Springs that you might be coming this way. Samuel reached you, Thomas said, relief evident in his voice. Collins nodded. Rode through the night. Good thing, too. Johnson and his posse figured out your trick this morning. Change course. They're maybe 4 hours behind you. The news hit Victoria like a physical blow. So close. After everything, they might still be caught before reaching safety. We need to keep moving, she said, instinctively tightening her hold on Hannah. No. Collins contradicted her. You need to split up. Thomas frowned. That wasn't the plan. Plans change when there's a posse breathing down your neck, Collins said flatly. Johnson's not a fool. He'll be watching the main road into Silverton, but he doesn't know about the old mining trail that comes in from the north. He turned to Victoria. Ma'am, you and the little one will go with my men. They'll take you in the back way, get you settled at Kate's boarding house. And Thomas, Victoria asked, not liking the idea of separation. Collins's expression was grim. Doc's coming with me. We're going to lead Johnson on a merry chase in the opposite direction, give him something to follow while you get safe to town. Thomas was already shaking his head. Too dangerous. If they catch you, they won't, Collins said with the confidence of a man used to staying one step ahead of the law. And if they do well, I've faced down worse than a blacksmith with a grudge. Victoria looked between the two men, sensing an old partnership, a history deeper than Thomas had revealed. You've done this before, she said, not a question, but a realization. Collins's weathered face creased in a brief smile. Doc and I go back a ways. Let's just say this isn't the first time we've had to separate a good person from bad law. Understanding dawned. Thomas Harrington was more than a former Army doctor with a promise to keep. He was some kind of outlaw, perhaps even a member of the vigilante groups that had operated in the territories where official justice was corrupt or absent. You don't have to do this, Thomas said to Collins. I got her out. That was my responsibility. You don't owe me. Save it, Collins interrupted. We both know debts don't work that way between us. He turned back to Victoria. Ma'am, I know you don't know me from Adam, but I'm asking you to trust me. For your sake and the child's. Victoria studied the older man, seeing beyond the rough exterior to something solid and trustworthy in his steady gaze. Whatever Thomas's past entanglements, Collins seemed a man who operated by a clear, if unconventional, moral code. Very well, she agreed, but I want your word that Thomas won't take unnecessary risks. Hannah and I have already lost too much. I won't lose the man who gave us back our freedom. If Collins was surprised by her fierceness, he didn't show it. You have my word, ma'am. Doc's too valuable to waste on a fool's errand. The men moved quickly after that, transferring the Victoria and Hannah's meager belongings to one of the pack horses. 2 of Collins's men would escort them to Silverton via the hidden trail, while Collins, Thomas, and the remaining rider would take the wagon on a conspicuous journey south away from the town. We'll meet at Kate's by midnight, Thomas promised as he helped Victoria mount behind one of their new escorts. If I'm not there by dawn, Collins will get you to Denver. There's money waiting there enough to start fresh somewhere else. Victoria looked down at him from horseback, suddenly reluctant to part. Despite the complexities and revelations of the past days, Thomas had become her anchor to the world beyond the cage, the first person in years to see her as a woman rather than a monster. Be careful, she said softly. Hannah needs to know the man who saved her mother. Thomas reached up to touch her hand where it rested on the saddle. I'll be there, he promised. We have justice to seek, remember. Victoria nodded, then turned to the trail ahead as their escorts led them away from the clearing. Hannah, secured before her on the saddle, twisted to wave goodbye to Thomas. Thomas, come back, the child asked as the trees swallowed the clearing behind them. Yes, Victoria assured her, hoping the words were true. Thomas will come back to us. As they rode towards Silverton by the secret northern path, Victoria felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear for the dangers still ahead. Grief for the truth she had learned about Edward's death, anxiety about their uncertain future. But beneath it all, like a small flame protected from the wind, burned something she had thought extinguished forever in that steel cage: hope. Hope that justice might yet be possible. Hope that her daughter might grow up free from the shadow of her mother's imprisonment. And hope, unexpected but undeniable, that Thomas Harrington might be more than just Edward's messenger or her rescuer, that he might become something she had never thought to find again. A companion for whatever uncertain future awaited beyond the mountains. Silverton clung to the mountainside like a determined prospector, its wooden buildings and canvas tents sprawling along the valley floor beneath the watchful gaze of snow-capped peaks. As dusk settled over the mining town, lamps flickered to life in windows, and the sounds of a piano drifted from the largest saloon on the main street. Victoria rode in silence behind her escort, a taciturn man who had introduced himself only as Reeves. Hannah had fallen asleep against her mother's chest, lulled by the steady rhythms of the horse's gait. The second man, younger and more nervous, rode ahead, as lookout occasionally doubling back to ensure they weren't followed. After 2 hours on the narrow trail that wound through dense pine forest and across tumbling streams, they emerged on the northern edge of town. Reeves led them down quiet back streets, avoiding the busier thoroughfares where miners celebrated the end of their shifts with whiskey and song. Kate's place is just ahead, he said, breaking his long silence. Blue house with the white trim. She's expecting you. Victoria nodded, too exhausted for conversation. The day's journey, combined with the emotional strain of parting from Thomas and the still fresh revelations about Edward's death, had drained what little strength she had rebuilt since her release from the cage. Kate's boarding house stood slightly apart from its neighbors, surrounded by a neat picket fence and boasting a small garden where early spring flowers pushed through the rocky soil. As they approached, the front door opened, spilling warm lamplight onto the porch. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall and straight-backed, her gray hair pulled into a severe bun. As Victoria dismounted, accepting Reeves's help with Hannah, the woman descended the steps to meet them. Mrs. Blackwood, she said, her voice low and cultured, at odds with the frontier setting. I'm Catherine Holloway. Please come inside quickly. Victoria followed her into the house, cradling the still sleeping Hannah. The interior was unexpectedly refined, polished wooden floors, actual wallpaper furniture that spoke of Eastern tastes rather than Western practicality. Your room is ready upstairs, Catherine said, leading the way through a parlor where two elderly men played chess by the fire, barely glancing up at the newcomers. You'll be safe here until Thomas arrives. You know Thomas well, Victoria asked as they climbed the stairs. Catherine's expression softened slightly. We have history, yes. He saved more than a few lives in his time, including mine. The room she showed them to was small but comfortable, with a double bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a rocking chair beside the window that overlooked the back garden. There's hot water for washing, Catherine said, indicating the covered pitcher on the washstand. And I'll bring up some supper shortly. Is there anything else you need for the child? Victoria looked down at Hannah, who was beginning to stir. She'll be hungry when she wakes, and perhaps, do you have a doll she might play with? Her own was left behind. Something like compassion crossed Catherine's stern features. I'll see what I can find. Rest now, Mrs. Blackwood. You're safe here. When the door closed behind her, Victoria sank onto the bed, the softness of a real mattress, almost painful after years of sleeping on the hard platform of her cage. She laid Hannah beside her, marveling at the simple miracle of having her child close, of being in a proper room, with a door she could close, of being addressed as Mrs. Blackwood, rather than the witch or the beast. Freedom was disorienting in its vastness after so long confined. Hannah woke fully as Catherine returned with a tray of food, and to Victoria's surprise, a beautifully crafted porcelain doll with a painted face in real cloth dress. This was my daughter's, Catherine explained. Hannah reached eagerly for the toy. She's grown now, with children of her own back east. I think she would be pleased to know it's being loved again. Victoria thanked her, touched by the unexpected kindness. As they ate the simple but nourishing meal of stew and fresh bread, Catherine hovered in the doorway, her expression thoughtful. Thomas sent word about your situation, she said finally, about the Pau and Edward's murder. Victoria stiffened, suddenly wary. How much had Thomas shared? How much could this stranger be trusted? As if reading her thoughts, Catherine continued. You needn't fear me, Mrs. Blackwood. I know what it is to be at the mercy of powerful men with secrets to protect. She touched her left hand absently, and Victoria noticed for the first time that 2 fingers were missing. 15 years ago, my husband was a judge in Montana Territory. He discovered corruption in the land office, much like your Edward did. They killed him for it. Tried to kill me too. I'm sorry, Victoria said softly, understanding now the bond that might exist between this refined woman and Thomas. Catherine nodded, accepting the sympathy. Thomas helped me disappear, start fresh here in Silverton. I've done the same for others since. There's a network of us across the territories, people who've seen the dark side of frontier justice and decided to create something better. A network of what vigilantes, Victoria asked, trying to understand. Some might use that word. Catherine's smile was thin. We prefer to think of ourselves as the true face of justice in places where the law has been corrupted. Thomas has been part of our efforts for nearly a decade. This revelation settled over Victoria like a heavy cloak. Thomas Harrington was more than a former army doctor honoring an old promise. He was actively involved in an underground movement that operated outside the law, however noble their intentions. Did he tell you about the federal marshal coming to Redemption Springs? Victoria asked. Catherine's expression grew grave. Yes, Marshal Hayes is a complicated man. Not corrupt like Caldwell, but rigid in his adherence to the letter of the law rather than its spirit. If he finds you, she left the implication hanging. He'll return me to the cage, Victoria finished. Or worse, to a proper prison where Thomas can't reach me. Precisely, which is why you can't stay in Silverton long. Once Thomas arrives, we'll need to move you further north, perhaps to Canada eventually. The immensity of what lay ahead struck Victoria with sudden force. A life on the run, a childhood for Hannah spent always looking over their shoulders. Was this truly freedom, or just a larger cage with invisible bars? What about justice for Edward, she asked. Thomas spoke of gathering evidence against Caldwell and Reynolds, of exposing what they did. Catherine sighed, sinking into the rocking chair by the window. Thomas has been pursuing that goal for years, Mrs. Blackwood. The evidence your husband collected has never been found. Without it, it's the word of known outlaws against respected officials. So we just disappear. Let them win. The injustice of it burned in Victoria's chest. Sometimes surviving is its own victory, Catherine said quietly. Giving your daughter a chance at a normal life, far from the shadows of the past, isn't that worth more than revenge? Victoria looked at Hannah now, contentedly playing with the doll on the bed, oblivious to the weight of history and hatred that had shaped her young life. Perhaps Catherine was right. Perhaps the true path forward lay not in looking back at Edward's murder and her own imprisonment, but in building something new from the ashes of the past. Get some rest, Catherine advised, rising from the chair. There's a lock on the door, and Reeves is keeping watch outside. I'll wake you when Thomas arrives. After she left, Victoria secured the door, then performed the simple rituals of preparing for bed washing. Hannah's face and hands, helping her into the clean nightgown Catherine had provided, combing out the child's golden curls. Ordinary moments that had been denied her for so long. When Hannah was settled under the quilt, already drifting towards sleep, Victoria stood by the window, gazing out at the unfamiliar town below. Somewhere out there, Thomas was risking his life to lead their pursuers away. The thought troubled her more than she had expected. In the short time since he had entered her life, Thomas Harrington had become more than a rescuer or a link to her past. He had become someone she found herself depending on, trusting, despite the secrets he had kept. Someone whose safety mattered to her in a way she hadn't allowed herself to care about anyone since Edward's death. Come back safely, she whispered to the darkness beyond the glass. We have unfinished business, you and I. Midnight came and went with no sign of Thomas. Victoria, who had dozed fitfully in the chair rather than risk deep sleep, startled at every sound from the street below. Horses' hooves, drunken laughter, once a brief shouting match that ended as quickly as it began. When a soft knock finally came at the door, the mantel clock showed nearly 2 a.m. Victoria rose swiftly, her heart hammering as she approached the door. Who is it? She asked quietly, not wanting to wake Hannah. It's me, came Thomas's voice rough with exhaustion. It's safe to open. Victoria unlocked the door to find Thomas leaning against the frame, his face haggard and smeared with trail dust. A long tear in his sleeve revealed a bandaged arm beneath. You're hurt, she said, drawing him inside and relocking the door. Thomas shook his head dismissively. It's nothing. Bullet grazed me when we were creating our diversion. He glanced toward the bed where Hannah slept. She's all right. Yes, sleeping soundly. Victoria guided him to the chair she had vacated. Sit before you fall, Thomas. You look half dead. He sank into the chair with a grateful sigh. Feel it too. Been a long day. Johnson's men. We led them 20 miles south, then split up to confuse the trail. Collins is still out there making sure they don't double back towards Silverton. Thomas rubbed a hand over his face, the gesture of a man pushed to his limits. But we can't count on them staying fooled for long. We need to be ready to move by dawn. Victoria poured water from the pitcher into the basin and found a clean cloth. Without asking permission, she began to clean the trail dust from Thomas's face with gentle strokes. He tensed at first, then relaxed under her ministrations, his eyes closing briefly. Catherine told me about your activities, Victoria said as she worked. About the network you're part of. Thomas's eyes opened, watching her reaction carefully. Does that change things for you? Victoria considered the question. A week ago, I might have said yes. The law was what imprisoned me, but it was also my only hope for legitimate freedom. Now, she shook her head. Now I understand that justice and law aren't always the same thing. No, Thomas agreed quietly. They aren't. Victoria set aside the cloth and perched on the edge of the bed facing him. Catherine also said the evidence Edward collected has never been found, that without it, exposing Caldwell and Reynolds may be impossible. Thomas's expression grew troubled. She's right. I've searched for years, followed every lead, questioned anyone who might know something. Whatever Edward discovered, Caldwell hid it well. Or destroyed it, Victoria suggested. Possibly, but men like Caldwell often keep leverage even against their allies. Insurance in case relationships sour. Thomas leaned forward, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his injured arm. Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before answering. She nodded, suddenly alert to the intensity in his voice. Did Edward ever mention a place, a location, a landmark, anything that held special significance to him? Somewhere he might have hidden something valuable. Victoria frowned, casting her mind back to conversations with her husband. He spoke often of a place in the mountains where he would go to think. A limestone cave near a waterfall. He called it his cathedral. Thomas straightened. Did he ever take you there? Once, shortly after we were married. Victoria closed her eyes, picturing the secluded grotto. It was difficult to reach. A narrow path along a cliff face, then down through a crevice in the rocks. Inside the cave, opened up into a large chamber. Water had shaped the stone into formations like sculptures or church spires, hence his name for it. Could you find it again? Thomas asked, a new energy animating his tired features. Victoria hesitated. Perhaps. It's been years, and it was in wild country, far from any trails or settlements. But if it was important to Edward, a place he valued for its solitude and security, it would be the perfect place to hide evidence. Victoria finished, understanding dawning. A location Caldwell would never know about or find. Thomas nodded, excitement breaking through his exhaustion. Exactly. Tomorrow we need to... A sharp knock at the door interrupted him. They both froze, exchanging alarmed glances. Then Catherine's voice came urgent and low. Thomas, Victoria, you need to leave. Now. Thomas was on his feet, instantly moving to the door. Catherine stood in the hallway, her face pale in the dim light. What's happened? He demanded. Marshal Hayes arrived on the evening stage, she said grimly. He's at the sheriff's office now, showing your descriptions. Someone must have sent a telegram ahead. Victoria had already begun gathering their few belongings, moving with the quiet efficiency of a woman accustomed to crisis. How long do we have? Minutes, not hours, Catherine replied. The sheriff is organizing a search of the town. It won't take them long to reach the boarding house. Thomas made a swift decision. We'll go out the back way. Are the horses still ready? Catherine nodded. In the stable behind the house. Reeves has them saddled. She handed Thomas a small leather satchel. Food money and clean bandages for that arm. There's a map too, marking the safest route north. North? Victoria questioned as she gently woke Hannah. But if Edward's cave might contain the evidence we need... The cave will have to wait, Thomas said firmly. Our priority now is getting you and Hannah to safety. Victoria wanted to argue, but knew he was right. Hannah blinked sleepily as Victoria addressed her, quickly murmuring reassurances to the confused child. Thomas hurt? Hannah asked, noticing his bandaged arm as he helped gather their belongings. Just a scratch, he assured her, with a gentle smile. Nothing to worry about, little one. Catherine led them downstairs and through the kitchen to a back door that opened onto a small yard. Beyond it stood a modest stable where Reeves waited with 3 horses, 2 saddled for riding, the third laden with supplies. The marshal's men are concentrating on the main streets, Reeves reported, but they're moving fast. You've got maybe 10 minutes before they start searching buildings. Thomas lifted Hannah into Victoria's arms, then helped them both onto one of the horses. Remember, stay on the trail marked on the map. It will take you to a cabin about 15 miles north of here. Wait for me there. Victoria's head snapped up. What do you mean, wait for you? Aren't you coming with us? Thomas's expression was resolute. I need to create another diversion. Give you time to get clear of town. No, Victoria's voice was sharp with sudden fear. We stay together. Victoria, listen to me. Thomas placed a hand on her knee, his eyes intense in the darkness. Hayes knows my face better than yours. If I lead him east while you go north, it doubles your chances of escape. And doubles your chances of being caught or killed, she countered. We need you, Thomas. Hannah and I can't do this alone. Something flickered in Thomas's expression. Surprise, perhaps, at her vehemence or at the implication that she needed him for more than just practical protection. Thomas, come too, Hannah added, reaching down from the saddle with a small, imperious hand. Please. He looked between them, the woman and the child who had somehow in the space of days become so important to him. Then he glanced at Catherine, who watched the exchange with knowing eyes. The child is right, Catherine said quietly. You've done enough lone crusading, Thomas. Some burdens are better shared. For a moment, Victoria thought he would refuse. Then his shoulders slumped slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance. All right, he said, mounting the second horse. Together. Relief flooded through Victoria, stronger than she had expected. She nodded to Catherine, trying to express with that simple gesture her gratitude for everything the woman had done. Go with God, Hud. Catherine said, stepping back from the horses. And remember, sometimes living well is the best revenge. They rode out through the back gate, keeping to shadow as they skirted the edge of town. In the distance, lanterns moved along the main street as the marshal search party began their work. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky, the moon providing just enough light to see the trail without betraying their position. Once clear of the last outlying buildings, Thomas led them north at a steady trot, faster than was comfortable, but necessary to put distance between themselves and pursuit. Hannah remarkably didn't complain, instead clinging to Victoria with the resilience of a child who had already adapted to more changes than most adults could handle. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hooves on the hard-packed trail and the occasional call of a night bird. Victoria's mind raced with the implications of what they had learned about Edward's cathedral. If evidence of Caldwell and Reynolds' crimes still existed hidden in that remote cave, it could change everything, transforming them from fugitives to vindicated victims, restore her reputation, secure Hannah's future. But first, they had to survive the night, evade the marshal, and reach safety. The trail narrowed as it climbed into the foothills, forcing them to proceed single file. Thomas led, constantly scanning the path ahead and the surrounding forest for signs of danger. Victoria followed, one arm securing Hannah, the other holding the reins with growing confidence as her body remembered the rhythms of horseback riding. "How much further?" she called softly as they paused to rest the horses beside a small stream. Thomas consulted the map by moonlight. "About 5 miles. The cabin should be just beyond that ridge." He nodded toward a dark outline against the star-filled sky. Victoria dismounted, carefully setting Hannah on her feet while keeping a firm hold on the child's hand. "And then what? We can't hide forever, Thomas." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of internal conflict. "Once we're sure the immediate danger has passed, we can consider our next steps. Maybe try to reach Edward's cave, see if there's anything there worth finding. And if there isn't, if the evidence is truly gone," Thomas looked at her directly, his face grave in the silvery moonlight, "then we have a choice to make: continue north to Canada, build new lives under new names. Or," he hesitated. "Or," Victoria prompted. "Or I turn myself in," he said simply, "confess to breaking you out of the cage. With my reputation as an army doctor and my connections in Denver, I might be able to secure a proper trial for you at last, one where the truth about your self-defense could be heard." Victoria stared at him, stunned by the offer. "You would sacrifice your freedom for mine." "I made a promise to Edward," Thomas replied, though something in his eyes suggested there was more to it than obligation now. Before Victoria could respond, Hannah tugged at her hand. "Mama's scary man," she whispered, pointing back down the trail they had just traveled. Victoria whirled, her heart seizing. In the distance, perhaps half a mile back, a pinpoint of light moved steadily along the trail, a lantern carried by someone following their path. "Thomas," she hissed, drawing his attention to the light. He saw it immediately, his body tensing. "Back on the horses, now." They mounted swiftly, Thomas lifting Hannah up to Victoria before swinging onto his own horse. Without another word, they urged their mounts forward, abandoning the careful pace of before for a more dangerous speed along the narrow mountain trail. The ridge that had seemed so distant now became their goal. If they could cross it before their pursuer closed the gap, the downward slope beyond might give them the advantage they needed. But the trail grew steeper, forcing them to slow or risk the horses breaking a leg in the treacherous terrain. The light behind them grew incrementally brighter, a relentless reminder of the closing distance. "There," Thomas said, suddenly pointing to a dark line that cut across the trail ahead, a ravine perhaps 20 feet wide, spanned by a crude log bridge. "Once across, we can cut the bridge, buy ourselves some time." They reached the bridge as the moon slipped behind a cloud, plunging the mountainside into deeper darkness. Thomas dismounted, testing the logs with his weight before leading his horse carefully across. Victoria followed, heart in her throat, as the ancient timbers creaked beneath them. On the far side, Thomas quickly tied the horses to a tree, then turned back to the bridge with a determined expression. "Keep going," he instructed Victoria. "I'll catch up after I deal with this." Victoria hesitated, reluctant to leave him, but the responsibility of Hannah's safety drove her forward. She remounted, settling Hannah before her, and continued along the trail while Thomas began prying at the supports of the bridge with a wooden lever found beside the path. She had gone perhaps 100 yards when a shout echoed across the mountainside. Turning in the saddle, Victoria saw the distant figure of their pursuer emerge from the trees on the far side of the ravine. Even at this distance, the metallic gleam of a badge was visible on his chest. Marshal Hayes had found them. Victoria reined in her horse, torn between fleeing with Hannah and returning to help Thomas. The decision was made for her when a gunshot cracked through the night air, the sound bouncing off the surrounding peaks. "Thomas," she cried, fear clutching at her throat. For an agonizing moment, there was silence. Then Thomas's voice came, strained but alive. "Keep going. I'm right behind you." Another shot rang out, followed by the sound of splintering wood and a man's angry shout. Victoria urged her horse forward, torn between terror and hope. Behind her came the thunder of hooves as Thomas's mount galloped to catch up. "The bridge?" she asked as he drew alongside. "Gone," he confirmed grimly. "But Hayes will find another crossing eventually. We need to reach the cabin and decide our next move." They rode hard for the next mile, the trail widening as it crested the ridge and began to descend into the next valley. The first pale light of dawn was just touching the eastern sky when they spotted the cabin, a solid structure of logs and stone nestled against a cliff face partially hidden by a stand of ancient pines. As they approached, Thomas raised a hand in warning. Something's not right. Victoria followed his gaze to the cabin's single window where the faintest glow of light was visible. Someone's there, she whispered. Thomas drew his pistol. Stay here with Hannah. If you hear trouble, ride north and don't look back. No, Victoria said firmly, dismounting and lifting Hannah down. We stayed together, remember? He looked as though he might argue, then nodded reluctantly. Stay behind me, then. They approached the cabin cautiously, Thomas leading with his pistol ready, Victoria following with Hannah held securely in her arms. The child, sensing the tension, remained silent, her small face buried against her mother's neck. At the door, Thomas paused, listening. From within came the soft crackle of a fire and what might have been the sound of movement. He glanced back at Victoria, silently mouthing a count, 1, 2, 3, then pushed the door open, stepping inside with his weapon raised. Don't shoot, Doc, came a familiar gravelly voice. It's just me. Jeremiah Collins sat beside a small fire in the cabin's stone hearth, calmly drinking coffee from a tin cup. His weathered face split in a grin at their expressions of shock. Figured you might need a friendly face about now, he said, rising to his feet. Coffee's hot if you want some. Thomas lowered his pistol, relief and confusion warring on his face. Collins, how did you get here ahead of us? Know these mountains better than you ever will, the former marshal replied with a shrug. Took some shortcuts once I was sure Johnson's boys were properly led astray. He nodded to Victoria and Hannah. Ma'am, little miss, you both look like you could use some rest. Victoria entered the cabin fully, her wariness giving way to exhaustion now that immediate danger had passed. The cabin was simple but comfortable, a table and chairs, a bed in one corner, shelves stocked with provisions. A haven, however, temporary. Hayes is behind us, Thomas explained as he closed and barred the door. Maybe 2 hours now that the bridge is out. Collins nodded, unsurprised. Catherine sent word. That's partly why I'm here to tell you there's been a change of plans. What kind of change? Victoria asked, settling Hannah on a blanket near the fire. Collins' expression grew serious. While I was leading Johnson's posse on a wild goose chase, I ran into an old friend, a courier for the governor's office. Seems there's been some interesting developments in Denver. Judge Reynolds was found dead 3 days ago. Thomas stiffened. Dead how? Officially, he shot himself, left a note confessing to various crimes, including conspiracy to commit murder. Collins' eyes fixed on Victoria, specifically the murder of Edward Blackwood. Victoria sank into a chair, the world tilting beneath her. Reynolds confessed to killing Edward, not to doing it himself, Collins clarified, to ordering it done. Implicated Caldwell as the one who actually administered the poison. Thomas paced the small confines of the cabin, agitation evident in every line of his body. This changes everything. With Reynolds' confession, we have a foundation for clearing Victoria's name. There is more, Collins said, reaching into his coat to withdraw a folded document. The governor has ordered a review of all cases prosecuted by Reynolds, including yours, Mrs. Blackwood. When combined with reports about your unusual incarceration, it was enough for him to issue this. He handed the paper to Victoria. With shaking hands, she unfolded it to find an official document bearing the territorial governor's seal. A provisional pardon, Collins explained, pending review of your case, but effective immediately. You're no longer a fugitive, Mrs. Blackwood. Victoria stared at the document, the words swimming before her eyes. Freedom. Real freedom, legal and acknowledged, seemed an impossible dream after so long. And me, Thomas asked quietly, I still broke her out of lawful custody, provisional pardon or not. Collins smiled slightly. The governor's a practical man. With Reynolds dead and Caldwell soon to be arrested, he's more concerned with closing this ugly chapter than pursuing the man who exposed it. There's no mention of charges against you in his communication. The tension that had held them all in its grip for days began to ease like ice, melting in spring sunshine. Victoria looked from the pardon to Hannah, who had fallen asleep by the fire, exhausted by their night-long flight. It's over, she asked, still unable to fully believe it. We can stop running. Almost, Collins said, tempering their relief. Hayes doesn't know about the pardon yet. He's still operating under his original orders to return you to Redemption Springs. Until we can get official word to him, you're safer staying hidden. Thomas nodded, accepting this reality. How long? A day, maybe 2. I've sent a rider to intercept Hayes with the governor's order. Collins rose, stretching his back with a grimace. In the meantime, this cabin is as safe as anywhere. I've stocked it with enough supplies to last a week if needed. Victoria's mind was already racing ahead past immediate safety to the future that now opened before them. What about Caldwell? If he learns Reynolds confessed, he'll run. Already thought of that, Collins assured her. The governor dispatched a special deputy to Redemption Springs with a warrant for Caldwell's arrest. Should be there by now. And Edward's evidence? Thomas asked. The documents he collected about their mining fraud? Collins shook his head. Reynolds' confession mentioned the evidence, but not its location. Said Caldwell claimed to have destroyed it all. Victoria and Thomas exchanged a look, a silent communication passing between them. Edward's cathedral, the cave where he had sought solitude, might still hold the missing pieces of the puzzle. We may know where to look, Thomas said carefully. Once Hayes is informed of the pardon and the immediate danger has passed. Collins raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. Well, that's for later. Right now, you all need rest. I'll keep watch. Victoria wanted to protest that she wasn't tired, but the events of the past days, the escape, the revelations, the flight from Silverton had drained her beyond measure. The prospect of sleep and safety with Hannah beside her, and no immediate threat looming, was too powerful to resist. Thomas must have seen the exhaustion in her face. Go, he said gently. Take the bed. Hannah needs proper rest, and so do you. Victoria nodded gratefully. She gathered Hannah from her place by the fire, the child barely stirring, as Victoria carried her to the bed in the corner. As she settled Hannah under the blankets, a wave of emotion swept through her gratitude, relief, and beneath it all, a tentative hope for the future that had seemed impossible just days ago. When she turned back to the room, Thomas was deep in conversation with Collins, their voices too low to make out the words. Their postures spoke of long association of trust built through shared dangers. Victoria wondered again about Thomas's life during the years he had searched for her, about the network of justice seekers Catherine had described. As if sensing her gaze, Thomas looked up, offering a tired smile that somehow conveyed both reassurance and a depth of feeling that made Victoria's heart quicken. Rest, he mouthed silently across the room. Victoria nodded and returned to the bed, stretching out beside Hannah. The mattress was thin, the blankets rough, but after 2 years of sleeping on bare wooden boards exposed to the elements, it felt like unimaginable luxury. Sleep claimed her almost instantly, deep and dreamless. Victoria woke to the sound of rain pattering against the cabin's roof and the quiet murmur of voices. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then Hannah stirred beside her, and the events of the past days came rushing back. The cage, the escape, the flight through the mountains, Reynolds' confession, and the provisional pardon. She sat up, noting that the light filtering through the cabin's single window suggested late afternoon. She had slept most of the day away. Hannah was still sleeping peacefully, one hand curled beneath her cheek. Victoria brushed a golden curl from her daughter's forehead, heart swelling with love and protective fierceness. Whatever came next, Hannah would never know the uncertainty and fear that had marked her early life. Victoria would make sure of that. Voices from outside drew her attention, rising quietly to avoid waking Hannah. Victoria moved to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could make out Thomas and Collins standing beneath the overhang of the cabin's small porch, deep in discussion. She couldn't hear their words, but Thomas's expression was intense, his hands moving in emphatic gestures as he made some point. Collins listened, nodding occasionally, his weathered face grave. Victoria turned from the window, giving them privacy for their conversation. She used the basin of water left by the bed to wash her face and hands, then combed her fingers through her tangled hair, wishing for a proper brush. After 2 years of neglecting such basic grooming in the cage, the desire to be clean, to look presentable, felt like reclaiming another small piece of her humanity. The cabin door opened, bringing with it a gust of damp air and the stronger sound of rainfall. Thomas stepped inside, shaking water from his hat, before noticing Victoria was awake. I didn't mean to wake you, he said softly, mindful of the still sleeping Hannah. You didn't, Victoria assured him. Where's Collins? Gone to meet his men. They've been patrolling the area, making sure Hayes doesn't stumble upon us before receiving word of your pardon. Thomas hung his damp coat on a peg by the door. How are you feeling? Victoria considered the question, taking stock of her physical and emotional state. Rested, she said finally, and hopeful, I think. It's an unfamiliar feeling after so long. Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. The pardon changes everything. Once Hayes is informed, you will be truly free to go wherever you choose to start fresh. Something in his tone caught Victoria's attention, a careful neutrality that suggested he was holding something back. And you, she asked, what will you do once this is over? He busied himself with adding wood to the fire, not meeting her gaze. Continue my work with Collins and the others, I suppose. There are still plenty of injustices that need addressing in the territories. I see. Victoria moved to the table, running her fingers along its rough-hewn edge. In Edward's cave, the possibility that his evidence still exists. I've been thinking about that, Thomas admitted, straightening from the fire. If you could guide us there, it might be worth investigating. Even if Reynolds confessed, the full extent of their corruption may still be hidden. Exposing it could help others who were wronged. Victoria nodded, decision crystallizing within her. Then that's what we'll do. As soon as Hayes receives word of the pardon, we'll go to the cave. Victoria, Thomas began, then hesitated. You don't owe this to anyone. You've suffered enough for Edward's crusade. You and Hannah could start fresh somewhere, leave all this behind. Is that what you think I should do? She asked, watching his face carefully. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as a sign of internal conflict. I think you deserve peace, a normal life, not more danger and painful memories. And what about justice, Victoria pressed? Not just for Edward and me, but for others Caldwell and Reynolds have harmed. What about your work with Collins and Catherine? Isn't that worth continuing? Of course it is, Thomas said with sudden intensity, but not at the cost of your safety or Hannah's future. Victoria took a step toward him, closing the distance between them. What if I believe in that work too? What if I want to be part of it? Thomas stared at her, surprise and something deeper flickering in his eyes. Victoria, you've just regained your freedom. You have a child to consider. The life Collins and I lead isn't safe, she finished for him. Stable, respectable. I spent 2 years in a cage, Thomas. I know better than most how fragile those things are, how quickly they can be taken away. She gestured toward Hannah, still sleeping peacefully. I want my daughter to grow up understanding that justice matters, that standing against wrong is worth the risk. What better way to teach her that than by example? Thomas shook his head, though whether in disagreement or amazement at her resolve wasn't clear. You're a remarkable woman, Victoria Blackwood. I'm a survivor, she corrected him. Like you, like Catherine, like all the others who found their way to your network. They stood in silence for a moment, the rain drumming on the roof, the fire crackling in the hearth. Something was shifting between them, the dynamic of rescuer and rescued giving way to something more equal, more complex. There's something else we need to discuss, Thomas said, finally, his voice lower. Something I've been avoiding. Victoria waited, sensing the importance of whatever he was struggling to say. After this is over, after we've investigated the cave, after your pardon is fully processed, you'll have choices to make. About your future and Hannah's. He paused, seeming to gather his courage. I want you to know that whatever you decide, He trailed off, frustration crossing his features at his inability to find the right words. Victoria felt a strange lightness in her chest, a fluttering sensation she had almost forgotten. Are you trying to say you'd like to be part of that future, Thomas? Relief washed over his face at her directness. Yes, if you'd allow it. Victoria studied him, this man who had kept a promise for decades, who had worked tirelessly to free her, who looked at her and saw not a monster or a victim, but a woman of strength and worth. I think, she said carefully, that Hannah and I would benefit greatly from having you in our lives. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was too soon for that, the wounds of their respective pasts still too fresh. But it was an acknowledgement of possibility, of a door opening rather than closing. Thomas's smile transformed his face, erasing years of worry and regret. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. Then we'll face whatever comes next, together. The moment was interrupted by Hannah's sleepy voice from the bed. Mama, Thomas. Victoria turned, still holding Thomas's hand. We're here, little one. Hannah sat up, rubbing her eyes with small fists. Then she looked at their joined hands and broke into a beaming smile that illuminated the cabin more effectively than the fire. Thomas, stay, she asked hopefully. Victoria exchanged a glance with Thomas, seeing in his eyes the same cautious joy she felt in her own heart. Yes, she told her daughter, Thomas is staying. Outside, the rain began to ease, the steady drumming softening to a gentle patter. Inside, a family began to take shape, not formed by blood or law, but by choice and circumstance, in the resilient human capacity for new beginnings. Victoria Blackwood, once imprisoned in a steel cage for all to gawk at, now stood at the threshold of a future she had never dared imagine. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be dangers to face, truths to uncover, wounds to heal. But she would face them as a free woman, with her daughter beside her, and a man who had crossed decades and mountains to keep a promise that had somehow transformed into something far more profound than obligation. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. And that, my dear Emma, is how your grandmother found her freedom and how our family began. Samuel Mitchell's voice had grown hoarse from the long telling, but his eyes remained bright with the power of memory. Emma sat cross-legged before the fire, her young face solemn with the weight of the story she had heard. But what happened next, Grandpa? Did they find the evidence in the cave? Did the marshal accept the pardon? Did Thomas and Victoria get married? Samuel chuckled, reaching for the cup of tea that had grown cold during his narrative. So many questions. Yes, they found Edward's documents hidden in a waterproof tin behind a rock formation in the cave. Yes, Marshal Hayes eventually accepted the pardon, though not without considerable grumbling. And yes, after a proper courtship, Thomas and Victoria were married in Denver the following spring. And Hannah, did she remember Elizabeth? They visited Elizabeth often as Hannah grew up. She became like a grandmother to your mother. Samuel's expression grew distant with memory. Elizabeth moved to Denver eventually to be closer to them. Lived to be 93 sharp as a tack until the very end. Emma leaned her chin on her hands, absorbing these new details. And the network, did grandmother really work with them too? Samuel nodded, pride evident in his weathered features. For many years, your grandmother's knowledge of healing proved invaluable to people fleeing injustice. And Thomas continued his work with Collins well into his 60s. He tapped his wooden leg, a relic of an old injury. Lost this limb helping a family escape some rather unpleasant men in Montana, but that's a story for another night. What about Sheriff Caldwell? Did he go to prison? Samuel's expression darkened slightly. He escaped the initial attempt to arrest him, fled to Mexico, we believe. Justice isn't always as neat and tidy as we might wish, Emma. But the important thing is that your grandmother's name was cleared and the corrupt system that had imprisoned her was exposed. Emma was silent for a moment, contemplating all she had learned about her family's history. Then she asked the question that had been forming throughout the telling. Is that why you and Mother always taught me to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard? Samuel's aged face creased in a smile of profound approval. Precisely, my dear. Your grandmother's legacy isn't just in our blood, it's in the values she instilled in us all. Justice, courage, compassion. The willingness to risk comfort and safety for what's right. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial tone. And do you know the most remarkable part of this legacy? Emma shook her head, eager for the revelation. Your grandmother lived to see you born, Samuel said softly. You were only 2 when she passed, so you wouldn't remember. But she held you in her arms and said you had the same look in your eyes that Hannah had, curious, fearless kind. Emma's own eyes widened at this connection to a past she had never known. Really, I wish I could remember her. In a way you do, Samuel assured her. Every time you stand up for someone weaker, every time you question an injustice, every time you show compassion where others show cruelty, you're remembering Victoria Blackwood in the way that mattered most. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the Colorado landscape in pristine white. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light on the faces of the old man and the young girl, living links in a chain of memory and principle that stretched back to a steel cage in a frontier town and to the remarkable woman who had refused to let that cage define her. Now, Samuel said, stretching his arthritic hands toward the fire, I believe that's enough storytelling for one night. Your mother will have my hide if she returns from town to find you still awake at this hour. Emma rose reluctantly, knowing he was right, but loath to break the spell of the story. Will you tell me more tomorrow, Grandpa, about their adventures after the pardon? Samuel chuckled. There are indeed many more tales to tell, but for now, bed. As Emma leaned down to kiss his weathered cheek, Samuel caught her hand, his expression suddenly serious. Remember, Emma, the strongest cages aren't made of steel. They're made of fear of giving up, of accepting injustice as normal. Your grandmother's greatest strength wasn't in surviving her imprisonment, but in refusing to let it imprison her spirit. Emma nodded, understanding dawning in her young eyes. I'll remember, Grandpa. I promise. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, Emma's mind was filled with images from the story, a steel cage in a dusty square, a woman with ice-blue eyes and unbroken dignity, a man who had kept a promise across decades, a child reunited with her mother. And somewhere in that tapestry of memory and imagination, Emma recognized threads of her own identity, the courage she hoped to embody, the justice she yearned to uphold, the compassion she strived to show. The woman in the steel cage was more than just a story from her family's past. It was a legacy, a responsibility, and a reminder that freedom, true freedom, was something that had to be fought for and protected in every generation. Emma fell asleep with that knowledge settling into her heart like a seed ready to grow into the same resilient strength that had defined her grandmother's remarkable life. And in the parlor below, Samuel Mitchell stared into the dying fire, remembering the young stable hand who had once carried warnings and messages between fugitives, who had witnessed firsthand the courage of a woman wrongfully imprisoned and the determination of a man who refused to abandon his promise. Good night, Victoria, he murmured to the dancing flames. Your story lives on. Outside, the snow fell silently, covering all traces of the past with its clean, forgiving blanket. But beneath that temporary covering, the truth remained in memories passed down and principles upheld, and in the enduring human capacity to find freedom, even in the darkest of circumstances. The steel cage was long gone, but the woman who had transcended it would never be forgotten.